Tonight, I want to tell you about Mustafar, a small volcanic world in the Outer Rim, and what it would mean to spend a single day on its surface without protection. It's a question that seems simple enough on the face of it, but the more you sit with it, the more it becomes something else entirely. A meditation on the limits of human survival, on what the body can endure, and on the strange ways that planets in the Star Wars galaxy become not just locations, but legends. Mustafar is one of those places that has earned its mythology the hard way, not through stories alone, but through the physics of its existence. The planet orbits between two massive gas giants, Mustafar and Lefrani, whose gravitational pull never stops, never relents, tugging at Mustafar's core with an embrace so tight that the world itself can never cool. The result is something close to perpetual motion. A planet caught in a grip of tidal forces so powerful that they keep the interior molten, the crust thin, and the volcanism constant. If you were to stand on Mustafar's surface, or rather, if you could stand there, which you almost certainly couldn't, the first thing you would notice is that the ground is not entirely ground at all. Rivers of lava, bright orange-red and luminous, wind across a landscape of blackened rock like arteries through a corpse. Whole seas of it pool in the low places, vast lagoons of liquid rock thousands of degrees hot, and everywhere you look, the horizon is interrupted by erupting volcanoes, plumes of ash and smoke rising into a hazy sky that never seems to clear. The atmosphere itself is toxic, choked with ash, thick with volcanic gases that corrode and poison in equal measure. And the heat, the fundamental, inescapable heat of the place, radiates from every direction at once. It comes from below through the rock, from above where the sun beats down on a thin and hostile atmosphere, and from the lava rivers themselves in waves so intense that an unprotected human being would die not in hours, but in minutes. I find myself thinking about that a lot when I consider what survival on Mustafar actually means. We tend to think of survival as something gradual, the slow accumulation of damage, the body failing piece by piece. But Mustafar doesn't work that way. Mustafar is not a place that takes its time with you. The planet has never needed to. It's been like this for billions of years, long before the Galactic Republic, long before the first explorers ever reached the Outer Rim, long before anyone even knew Mustafar existed. And it will continue to be like this for billions of years more. The tidal forces won't stop, the core won't cool, the volcanoes won't grow quiet. In the ancient past, before spacefaring civilizations ever reached this system, Mustafar was simply a dead world, a forge of nightmares spinning through the darkness with no one to witness it. And then, eventually, people came. They came from the core worlds, from the mid-rim, from every direction, drawn by the same hunger that always draws people to dangerous places. The promise of wealth, of valuable minerals that only exist in the deepest heat, that can only be extracted where no one with sense would ever go. They brought tools, then machines, then technology that seemed to teeter on the edge of the impossible. The native Mustafarians, tall and thin in the north, shorter and more heavily built in the south, had already adapted to the hellscape they were born into, their biology shaped by countless generations of exposure to poison and heat and pressure that would destroy almost any other species. They worked the mines, walking across platforms built over seas of lava, extracting ores from the cooling magma, using methods and intuitions that outsiders could barely comprehend. And for a long time, Mustafar remained something approaching stable. A place of horror, yes, but a stable horror. One that people had learned to work around and within. One that had become almost ordinary in its dreadfulness. Then came the Clone Wars, and everything changed. Mustafar became not just a mining colony, but a secret stronghold. A place where the Separatist Council fled in the war's final days, hiding in vast facilities built directly into the volcanic rock of the Northern Hemisphere, hoping that the heat and the gases and the isolation would be shield enough. And it was during those final, desperate days of the war that Mustafar wrote itself into history in a way it never could have through mining operations or industry alone. Anakin Skywalker came to this planet, and Obi-Wan Kenobi came after him, and the two of them faced each other on the edge of a lava precipice, while the planet itself seemed to burn around them. That confrontation, that moment of mythology and fire, changed everything about how the galaxy understood Mustafar. It was no longer just a hell world. It became the site where a hero fell and a villain rose, where the clone wars ended not with a negotiation or a surrender, but with fire and betrayal on the edge of an inferno. Even now, long after those events, Mustafar carries that weight. Vader himself built a castle there, a fortress of black stone erected over a dark side cave, a place where the master of the Empire chose to make his home, as if the heat and the toxicity and the sheer hostility of the world suited him better than any other location in the galaxy. But before all that mythology, before any of the history that would make Mustafar a legend, there is simply the fact of the planet itself. There is the reality of what it does to a human body, what the heat does, what the gases do, what the pressure does, the way all of those forces combine into something that is simply impossible to survive without extraordinary technological intervention. And that is what we're going to explore together over the course of this story. We're going to walk backward through time to understand how Mustafar came to be, to meet the people who first tried to survive there, to understand the technology they developed, the failures and the rare successes, the incredible evolution of environmental suits that made it possible to work on the surface at all. We're going to examine the actual physiology of what happens to the human body in that environment, minute by minute, the cascade of failures that unfold once you step outside of protection onto the lava-burned surface. And we're going to understand, really understand, not in an abstract way, but in the concrete and specific reality of physics and biology and chemistry, why the answer to the question, could you survive a day on Mustafar, is quite simply no. Not because of story, not because of narrative stakes, but because the planet itself won't allow it. So settle in with me, and let's begin at the beginning with the planet as it exists right now, in this moment, in all its terrible and indifferent majesty. Mustafar was not always a world of fire, though I wonder sometimes if it has ever been anything else. In the ancient past, billions of years before the first spaceships ever founded, Mustafar was formed in darkness, in the deep cold of the outer reaches of the galaxy where few stars burn bright. It began, as so many worlds do, as a collection of dust and rock and material drawn together by gravity, slowly accreting into something solid. But Mustafar's story diverged almost immediately from the quiet paths that other planets follow. You see, Mustafar does not orbit alone. The planet sits nestled between two gas giants, Jestafad and Lefrani, two massive worlds so large and so close that their gravity wells compete constantly for the smaller world between them. This is not a stable arrangement, the kind that permits a planet to cool and settle and eventually rest. This is a gravitational tug-of-war that has never stopped, not for a moment, not for billions of years. Jestafad pulls, then Lefrani pulls back, and Mustafar is stretched between them like a rope in the hands of two giants who will never let go. That constant, unrelenting stress creates heat, friction between the planet's layers, pressure building and releasing and building again in an endless rhythm. The interior of Mustafar never cools. The core never settles. Instead, it churns. Deep within the world, the stone itself is kept in a state of perpetual motion, melting and rising and falling in great convective currents that never cease, driven by that endless gravitational massage from above. And as the interior churned, the surface responded. You cannot keep a world's heart boiling without consequences. The heat seeks outlets, pathways to escape, and so Mustafar's crust fractured, not once, but continuously in an ongoing conversation between the burning interior and the thin skin of solid rock above it. Lava emerged, great flowing rivers of molten stone that carved channels across the landscape, that pooled in massive seas, that cooled briefly only to be overwhelmed by new eruptions pushing up from below. This was not the surface of a planet settling into stability. This was something far more turbulent. This was geological violence made permanent, made eternal, made part of the world's fundamental nature. And yet, there is something to understand about that violence. The same geological processes that made Mustafar inhospitable also made it valuable. When lava rises from the depths of a world, it brings with it things that have been cooked in the pressure and heat of a planetary core, rare minerals, ores that cannot form anywhere else, elements of such density and purity that the rest of the galaxy would eventually travel to this hellscape seeking them. Mustafar became, in a strange and terrible way, a place of abundance. Abundance purchased at the cost of habitability. Abundance born from chaos. The surface itself developed a geography of fire. The northern hemisphere, the region most actively tormented by the tidal stresses, became a place of constant eruption. Lava rivers, lava seas, volcanic vents that never close, a landscape that is hostile to anything soft, anything fragile, anything that requires stability to exist. The southern hemisphere, slightly cooler, slightly more forgiving, still presented conditions that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. But at least it offered something, mineral deposits that could be reached, deposits that made the southern regions a target for anyone desperate or bold enough to try. And in the midst of this hellscape, something extraordinary happened. Life emerged. Not on the surface, where the temperatures and the toxins make survival impossible, but in the depths, in the heat, in the places where the geological violence is so extreme that it becomes almost generative. The Mustafarians evolved, or perhaps they arrived and adapted. The records are old and unclear on this point, but what matters is that they became something suited to the world they inhabited. They are not like you and me. The Mustafarians, at least the northern ones, the taller ones who make their home in the worst of it, developed a physiology that tolerates heat that would vaporize human tissue, that allows them to move across landscapes of molten rock with something approaching ease. They learned to ride creatures, lava flea-like beings that could themselves navigate the burning rivers, and they built skiffs that could skim across rivers of liquid stone. They became creatures of the fire, not despite it, but because of it. There is something almost beautiful in that adaptation, though I find it unsettling to dwell on for too long. What would it take to reshape a living thing so completely? What does it say about a world that only the most radical transformation permits life at all? And perhaps this is where the darkness begins to creep in, though we are still far from the events that would make Mustafar legendary. The planet's affinity for extremity, for the transformation of matter and flesh, for heat that strips away everything fragile and leaves only what is essential and hard. These things left an impression on the Force itself. We will speak more about this later, about the Sith presence, about the connection between the planet's nature and the dark side of the Force, but it is worth planting the seed now. Mustafar is not simply a hostile environment. It is a place where the very fundamentals of existence are tested, where softness becomes liability, where adaptation is survival, where transformation is the only option. Billions of years of gravitational stress, of molten stone, of unrelenting heat and pressure. These are not incidental details. They shape everything that comes after, everything that the planet will become. And so we arrive at the central paradox of Mustafar's existence. It is a world so hostile that only the most transformed beings can survive it. And yet the very resources it produces, the very minerals born from its violent interior, are precious enough that beings will risk that hostility, will die in that hostility, will return again and again, seeking what only Mustafar can provide. The planet pulls and repels simultaneously, attractive and lethal, a world that offers everything at the price of everything. And it has always been this way, will always be this way, as long as Mustafar and Lefrani continue their eternal gravitational dance. In the earliest records that survived, long before the Republic's archives grew thick with documentation, there are only scattered references to what lay in the Atravis sector of the Outer Rim, whispers from traders and explorers whose ships ventured that far from the galactic core and found themselves face to face with something they could barely comprehend. The first civilizations to reach Mustafar did not come looking for it specifically. They came because the mathematics of early hyperspace travel were unforgiving, and sometimes a ship would emerge from the jump in the Mustafar system and realize, with a kind of quiet dread, exactly where it had arrived. What they found was a world that seemed actively hostile to the very concept of visitation. Two massive gas giants, Mustafar and Lefrani, hanging in the sky like the eyes of something watching them, their gravitational pull so intense that the smaller planet between them was in a state of perpetual agony. The tidal forces those giants exerted never ceased, and never would cease, and what they were doing to Mustafar's interior was creating a world that could not rest, could not settle, could not find equilibrium. The surface, when the earliest explorers managed to get close enough to observe it, appeared to be a landscape that was still being born, or perhaps was dying, continuously, and then being reborn in the same moment. Lava rivers, impossibly thick and slow as they cooled, carved channels across the volcanic plains. Lava falls hung from cliff edges like waterfalls of stone, suspended in their final moment before hardening. And everywhere, the thermal shimmer made distance itself seem uncertain. These early visitors did not stay long, and they did not attempt to settle in any meaningful way, though some of them did leave records, fragmentary, hard to parse now, but worth examining for what they suggest about the first human reaction to the planet's reality. The heat, they noted, was beyond scale. Their instruments registered temperatures that pushed past what they believed their equipment could measure, and after a time, they stopped trying to be precise and simply wrote, "Hotter than anything we have ever encountered." The atmosphere was toxic in ways that seemed designed specifically to prevent respiration, thick with sulfuric compounds and volcanic ash and gases that attacked metal and organic tissue with equal indifference. What strikes me most forcefully about reading these early accounts is how they capture the moment of reckoning, the instant when an explorer realizes that a world is not hostile because it is defending something or preserving something, but because hostility is simply its nature, the default state of matter on that planet. There was nothing to conquer here, and nothing to negotiate with. There was only a place where almost nothing could exist, and the recognition of that fact seems to have sobered the earliest visitors in a way that later, more profit-driven expeditions would not be sobered. And yet, and this is the part that troubles me when I think about it, even as these early accounts express this recognition, there are hints that some explorers could not fully accept it, that some part of them was already beginning to think about how one might, theoretically, survive there. Perhaps mine there, if the hostility could be managed somehow. Perhaps establish a foothold if the right technology could be developed. Perhaps turn the planet's isolation and harshness into an advantage, a fortress where only you could operate because you had learned to endure what no one else could. This impulse, this idea that what is hostile can be transformed through ingenuity and will and enough suffering into useful. This impulse is so deeply threaded through the history of exploration and conquest that it appears almost automatically, like a reflex. And Mustafar, of course, was not an exception to that pattern, though the planet had not yet revealed what would eventually draw such intense interest: the rare minerals and compounds that lay buried in its volcanic geology, waiting for someone desperate or clever or desperate and clever enough to figure out how to extract them. The Mustafarians, living in these conditions, were already here, of course. They had evolved under the relentless pressure of the tidal stresses and the volcanic landscape, and their very existence was proof that survival was possible, even if the mechanisms of that survival remained mysterious to the outside visitors. They rode creatures called lava fleas across the molten terrain, great arthropod beasts that seemed to navigate the landscape as if it were home. Because it was home, because their biology was native to this inferno in a way that no visiting species could hope to match. The Mustafarians mined these volcanic plains themselves, extracting precious minerals and ores from the rock and the ash. And when the early explorers encountered them, there seems to have been a kind of mutual recognition that passed between them. The visitors realizing that these beings, these Mustafarians, were not separate from the planet, but part of it, expressions of what life could become if it had to endure Mustafar long enough. The records do not detail these early encounters in much depth, which is perhaps telling. Perhaps the explorers did not fully understand what they were witnessing, or perhaps they understood perfectly and found it unsettling enough that they did not dwell on it in writing. What we do know is that the early visitors did not stay, did not establish colonies, did not attempt to claim the planet for whatever distant powers or trading consortiums had sent them out into the Atravis sector in the first place. They noted its existence, they marked its coordinates, they recorded their observations about its hostility, and then they turned their ships around and went back to worlds where the air was breathable and the surface did not try to kill you in minutes. And for a long time after that, Mustafar remained remote, obscure, a place that appeared in reports and charts, but held no obvious commercial value and no obvious purpose in the wider galaxy. It would take much later ages, much more sophisticated understanding of what could be done with rare minerals, much harder desperation, and much sharper greed, before anyone would truly decide that Mustafar was worth the risk of returning to. But the seed had been planted, the knowledge that something valuable lay beneath that hellish surface, waiting. And that knowledge, small as it was, would eventually change everything about what happened on Mustafar in the eras to come. And so they came back. Not immediately, not in great numbers, but they came back, drawn by the knowledge that something lay beneath that inferno, something worth the risk. The earliest mining attempts on Mustafar are shadowed in history, so distant now that we know them mostly through fragmented records and the slow accumulation of evidence, the way archaeologists piece together a civilization from shards. But what we can gather is this. Long before the Republic, before the Jedi Order took its formal shape, beings from across the Outer Rim were already making the choice to descend into one of the galaxy's most lethal environments in pursuit of minerals no other world could offer. Because that is what Mustafar gives you, if you are willing to take it, if you are willing to die for it. The lava itself, you see, is not simply destruction, it is also transformation. As molten rock rises from the planet's churning core and flows across the surface, it carries with it rare elements, crystals, compounds that form nowhere else in the known galaxy, minerals of extraordinary value and extraordinary rarity. To extract them, you would need to walk into rivers of liquid fire. You would need to reach into the very mechanism of a world that does not want you there and take from it what it guards. The Mustafarians had learned to do this, had evolved to do it. Their bodies adapted across generations to withstand heat that would reduce most organic matter to ash in minutes. They had developed a relationship with the lava itself that outsiders could barely comprehend, riding creatures called lava fleas, massive insectoid things that could traverse the molten rivers as if they were shallow streams, their carapaces hardened against temperatures that killed everything else. When the early explorers returned to Mustafar, they came not to study this ecosystem, but to exploit it. And so began the long, incremental process of learning how to mine a world that actively resisted being mined. The equipment they brought was crude by later standards, metal tools that had to be reworked constantly as the heat warped them, containers that could hold molten material for only brief stretches before failing, suits of lava-resistant material that protected for a time and then simply burned away. They learned through failure and death, through watching what the Mustafarians could do and attempting to replicate it, understanding that their own bodies could never achieve what native physiology had managed across millions of years of evolution. So they built instead. On the hardened rock plateaus that rose above the lava flows like islands in an ocean of fire, they began to construct mining structures, operations centered around the extraction and processing of minerals from the molten rivers below. These were not elegant constructions. They were brutal, functional, designed to serve a single purpose: to hold long enough for workers to extract what was valuable and then be rebuilt when the heat finally broke them. The Mustafarians themselves, particularly the smaller northern subspecies, became the labor force upon which these operations depended. Shorter than their southern cousins, adapted to withstand the heat, they were the only beings who could work the mines for extended periods without the constant technological mediation that would later become necessary. They understood the lava intuitively in a way no outsider could. When a flow was about to shift, when a plateau was becoming unstable, which passages through the volcanic terrain were safe and which would lead to death. And there is something I find myself thinking about a lot in the context of what would come later. From the very beginning, the mining of Mustafar was built on a hierarchy, on the exploitation of those adapted to it by those desperate enough to want what it contained. The northern Mustafarians did the work. The offworlders took the minerals, the profit, the value. It was a relationship that would persist and intensify as the centuries accumulated and technology advanced. The minerals themselves became legend in certain circles, crystals that held properties useful for tools, for weapons, for technologies that required materials that could withstand extremes of heat and pressure and still retain their structural integrity. Some whispered that the lava of Mustafar held something else, something deeper, a connection to forces that went beyond simple geology. There were old stories, older than the Republic itself, that spoke of a lush world that had once existed here, before something catastrophic and terrible had transformed it, had burned it down to what it was now. Whether there was truth in those stories, or whether they were simply the mythology that accumulated around anything strange and powerful, no one could say. But the fact that they existed, that people believed them, that the idea persisted that Mustafar had been transformed by something vast and dark, it added a weight to the place beyond simple economics, beyond the simple calculus of risk and reward. The early mining operations grew slowly, incrementally, never large enough to exhaust the resources, always limited by the practical constraints of working in an environment so fundamentally hostile to life. A miner might spend 5, 10, sometimes 20 years on Mustafar before the accumulated damage to their body became unbearable, before the heat and the toxins and the sheer unrelenting pressure of existing in that place forced them to leave or die. They developed techniques, knowledge accumulated through trial and error, passed along from one generation of workers to the next. How to move quickly across the lava fields to minimize exposure, how to read the behavior of lava fleas and move with them rather than against them, how to construct equipment that would survive longer before the heat took it, how to breathe in air that wanted to scald your lungs. It was knowledge written in scars, in the shortened lifespans of miners, in the families who waited on distant worlds for relatives who sometimes returned and sometimes did not. And through all of this, the Mustafar system remained on the edges of galactic awareness, a place people went to die young in pursuit of wealth, a place that outsiders approached with a kind of dark fascination, dangerous, yes, but valuable, hostile, but rewarding for those desperate or ruthless enough to work it. The mining never stopped, not entirely, across all the centuries of the pre-Republic era and the era that would follow. It simply changed, adapted, grew more sophisticated, more efficient, more exploitative. But the essential dynamic remained the same. Off-worlders pursuing wealth, the Mustafarians providing the labor that made it possible, and Mustafar itself, indifferent and eternally burning, giving up its minerals to those willing to pay the price. And I think there is something worth sitting with, in the fact that long before Mustafar became famous for the legendary duel that would unfold on its surface, it was already a symbol of something darker, a place where the pursuit of profit and power could justify sending beings into conditions that would inevitably harm them, that would inevitably shorten their lives in service to wealth for others. The price was always paid by someone else. It would remain that way. In the years before the Clone Wars became open conflict, the galaxy's great engines of commerce were already turning, sorting themselves into factions and alliances along the lines of profit and ideology. And among these engines, none burned quite so hot as the Techno-Union. The Techno-Union was not a government or a military force in the traditional sense. It was something more fundamental than that, and perhaps more dangerous. A commerce guild built on the premise that advanced technology and unlimited industrial capacity could solve any problem, including the problem of war itself. At its head stood Wat Tambor, a Skakun whose name you will hear again before this story ends, a being whose species came from a world of such crushing atmospheric pressure that they could not exist anywhere else without the constant intervention of technology, suit-bound and isolated, forever sealed away from the air around them. There is something to sit with in that detail. A man who cannot breathe the air of any world but his own, leading an organization that would reshape the worlds of others to suit its purposes. Wat Tambor did not think of himself as a villain, which is almost never the comfortable way of such men. He thought of himself as rational, as someone who understood that the old republic was inefficient, bloated, too slow to adapt to the demands of a modern galaxy. The Techno-Union possessed droid foundries of staggering capacity, factories that could turn raw materials into weapons and machines at a scale the Republic's traditional militaries could barely comprehend. If a new order was to come, Wat Tambor believed it would come because someone had the vision to industrialize it completely, to build an army that did not rely on biological soldiers who tired or broke or questioned orders. And for that vision, the Techno-Union needed resources, materials of extraordinary quality, ores and minerals that could be refined into the alloys and compounds required for the most advanced droids, the most sophisticated machinery. This is where Mustafar entered the calculation. Already, the planet was known to miners and prospectors as a place of impossible wealth, a world that had been picking itself apart for profit long before the Techno-Union turned its attention there, where the Mustafarians themselves had mined the volcanic rock for generations, understanding intuitively which lodes held the most precious metals, which flows of lava moved slowly enough to harvest. But the Mustafarians mined carefully, sustainably almost, the way a creature mines its own home, taking what was needed, respecting the rhythms of the volcanic cycle. The Techno-Union looked at Mustafar and saw something different, a resource to be exploited at maximum velocity, a world whose mineral wealth could be extracted wholesale, shipped off-world, refined into the building blocks of war. By the time the Clone Wars began in earnest, the Techno-Union had seized control of Mustafar's mining operations, displacing or subordinating the traditional Mustafarian miners, bringing in their own equipment, mining collectors and lava-resistant machinery, droid overseers and automated refineries built directly into the volcanic rock itself. Wat Tambor never set foot on Mustafar's surface, or if he did so in a state of maximum protection, his pressurized suit maintaining around him a bubble of Skakun atmosphere, keeping the planet's lethal heat and poison at arm's length, experiencing Mustafar only as a resource to be quantified and extracted. There is an unintentional irony in that, I think. A man who cannot breathe anywhere but his home world dictating how another world would be breathed. Or rather, not breathed, not lived in, not respected as a home, but simply drained. The mining operations themselves became vast and terrible in their efficiency. Mustafar's lava flows, those same rivers of molten rock that the planet's native species had learned to navigate and understand, became industrial zones, their heat and movement harnessed as power sources, their mineral-rich composition treated as commodity. Platforms were constructed on hardened plateaus, stable ground surrounded by rivers of lava, places where droids could labor without rest, where machines could process raw material in an endless mechanical rhythm. The Mustafarians who remained, those not driven away or repurposed into the supply chain, found their world transformed into something they barely recognized, their home made industrial, their relationship to the lava and stone altered from one of coexistence to one of extraction. The minerals flowed off-world in steady streams, loaded into cargo freighters bound for the Techno-Union's factories, where they would be refined into metals for droid bodies, compounds for energy weapons, alloys for armor and machinery. What Tamba's gamble was this? If the Techno-Union could control the war's supply of the highest-grade materials, if they could build droids faster and more efficiently than the Republic could build soldiers, then the separatist cause would eventually exhaust the old government simply through superior industrial capacity. It was a bet on technology, on scale, on the idea that enough machines could overcome any other consideration. And for a time, it almost worked. The droid armies grew vast, flooding across worlds with an uniformity and efficiency that the Republic's scattered clone legions struggled to match. But Mustafar itself became something else in the process. Not just a mining colony, but a seat of power for the separatist leadership. A fortress hidden in the volcanic waste where the highest members of the Confederacy could retreat as the war began to turn against them. The Klega Corp mining facility, built deep into Mustafar's rock and magma, became a stronghold, a place thought to be secure precisely because so few beings could survive approaching it. Wat Tambor in his pressurized suit could walk its controlled corridors. The Mustafarians, evolved for heat and toxin, could labor in its outer reaches. The droids, of course, could function anywhere. But for the Republic, for any conventional military force, Mustafar represented a kind of outer limit, a world so extreme that even the pursuit of enemies seemed to demand more than any commander could reasonably ask. There is something worth reflecting on here. How a world that was already lethal, already a place where survival demanded absolute adaptation, became even more hostile once it was made into an engine of war. The exploitation deepened the danger. The industrialization of Mustafar's resources made the planet itself a deadlier place. Those rare minerals that had taken millennia to form in Mustafar's volcanic core were being extracted in years, flooding the mining operations, sustaining a war that would ultimately determine the fate of the entire galaxy. In his pressurized suit, breathing only the air of his home, Wat Tambor never had to confront the reality of what Mustafar was becoming, a world being consumed to fuel an army of machines, a place where adaptation and industry were grinding against each other with no resolution but exhaustion. The gamble had been placed, the machinery set in motion, and Mustafar, that ancient hellworld, had become something new. Not just a place that killed the unprepared, but a place being killed itself, stripped of its resources in service of a vision of unlimited technological power. And at the end of that war, someone else would come to Mustafar, not for its minerals, but for the people who had gathered there thinking they were safe. When you build something meant to last on a world that wants to destroy it, you learn very quickly that the structure itself becomes a kind of defiance. The Techno-Union understood this perfectly, and in the decades before the Clone Wars reached their inevitable end, they built something on Mustafar that should not have been possible. Not a settlement, not an outpost, but an industrial fortress driven down into the planet's own bones. These were not temporary installations or desperate shelters for a handful of explorers willing to risk their lives for quick profit. What Wat Tambor and the Techno-Union constructed was something far more ambitious, and in its way, far more revealing about the nature of galactic ambition. The largest mining complex on Mustafar was built directly into the volcanic rock itself. Platforms sunk into the hardened crust like a fortress burrowed into a mountain, and the decision to build downward rather than upward tells you something important about the engineers who designed it. By going deep, They could use the planet's own thermal mass as insulation, letting the heat that would kill them above ground become something they could work around or even harness. The structures were reinforced with alloys developed specifically for high-temperature environments, materials that had to remain rigid and sealed while being baked continuously in temperatures that approached 1,300 degrees. Imagine metal that has to be strong enough to contain that kind of heat without warping, without failing, without the seams separating and spilling the breathable interior to the toxic ash outside. The engineering required to even conceive of such a thing was extraordinary. But more extraordinary still was the fact that they built it, and they built it quickly, because Wat Tambor believed that an endless supply of rare minerals extracted at industrial scale could win a war. He was a Skakon, a being whose biology meant he could breathe only the specific atmospheric composition of his home world, which meant he had to wear a containment suit on every world he visited, including Mustafar, including the facility that bore his vision. There's something poignant in that detail if you sit with it. A man who could never breathe the world he was reshaping, who had to move through it sealed away, dependent on technology to even exist in the presence of his own ambitions. The mining complex featured collection arms that extended over the lava rivers themselves, reaching down into the molten streams to harvest ore as it cooled along the banks, or sometimes plunging into the heat itself to pull up minerals that had crystallized in the inferno. These were mechanical appendages, many meters long, controlled from the safety of reinforced control stations, operated by droid workers and Mustafarian laborers who had evolved over millions of years to survive what no other being could. The Mustafarians, particularly the smaller northern subspecies adapted to the hottest regions, had learned long ago how to coexist with the lava itself, riding creatures called lava fleas that traversed the broken terrain, navigating channels of molten rock with a kind of fluid grace that the larger mining operations could only mimic with machinery. But now, under the Techno-Union's control, the pace of extraction accelerated beyond anything the Mustafarians had ever attempted on their own. Where they had harvested carefully, taking what the planet offered at a sustainable pace, the industrial apparatus demanded everything, demanded it constantly, demanded it whether the world had time to recover or not. The mining complexes became a kind of circulatory system for the planet's resources, pulling minerals out and feeding them up conveyor lines and into collection centers where they were processed, refined, loaded onto freight vessels that would carry them across the stars to droid factories and weapons foundries and shipyards building the machinery of the Clone Wars. By the end of the conflict, multiple facilities operated across Mustafar's surface, each one a technological triumph and a kind of wound in the planet's landscape. There was something almost architectural about the relationship between the Mustafarians and the mining operations that had now colonized their world. The native peoples had been integrated into the industrial apparatus, not as equals or even as partners, but as a specialized tool, beings whose adaptation to an inhospitable environment made them uniquely valuable as laborers in conditions that would kill anyone else. They rode their lava fleas in the service of the mines now, their ancient understanding of the terrain repurposed for profit, their relationship with the planet they had learned to live in transformed into a relationship of exploitation. It is one of those quiet horrors that runs through the history of the galaxy without fanfare, the way that those best suited to survive a harsh environment are so often the first to be used up by those with the power to demand it. The technical specifications of the facilities, the heat-shielded walls, the sealed corridors, the reinforced observation platforms, these were genuine achievements in engineering, real solutions to real problems of impossible physics and chemistry. But the human, or rather, the galactic cost of those achievements, the way that ambition and resources and the logic of war transformed a fragile ecosystem and a native population into an industrial engine, that cost was never calculated into the designs. As the Clone Wars deepened in their final year, the mining operations accelerated further still. because word had begun to spread through the separatist leadership that the end might be coming, that defeat might be possible, and Wat Tambor, who had bet everything on the assumption that unlimited material resources could outweigh the strategic brilliance of the Republic and the Jedi, began to believe that he needed to extract everything to maximize every output, to squeeze the last possible ore from Mustafar's molten veins before the war's logic finally caught up with him. The facility that had been built as an industrial fortress became something else in that final moment, a refuge, a place to gather the leadership of the separatist cause and protect them from what was coming, a last fortress against the inevitable. And there, on platforms overlooking lava rivers, in corridors built directly into volcanic rock, in spaces that only existed because engineers had dared to build impossibly, something was about to unfold that would make Mustafar legendary for reasons that had nothing to do with mining or material extraction or the logic of industrial production. But that is a story that still has a ways to go. What happens to the human body on Mustafar is not a mystery, though it is something most people never have to think about, a catalogue of failures, each one final, each one precise. The body you are wearing right now, the one that is listening to this story, is an extraordinary machine. 37 degrees Celsius at its core, a temperature maintained with such vigilance that even a shift of 2 or 3 degrees upward triggers panic. Your skin will sweat, your heart will race, your breathing will quicken, because your body understands, at some cellular level, that its temperature is the boundary between survival and catastrophe. Mustafar does not recognize such boundaries. When you step onto its surface, assuming you are unprotected, unarmored, simply a human being in ordinary clothes, the ambient temperature in the air around you is already lethally hot. We are talking about an environment where the very atmosphere, the air you would try to breathe, sits at temperatures that would cook tissue on contact. The radiant heat from the lava rivers and the superheated rock beneath your feet does not wait for you to move closer. It reaches outward and begins its work immediately. Your skin, which is designed to dissipate heat into a cooler environment, suddenly finds itself in a place where the environment is far hotter than it is, which means heat is flowing in, not out. Immediately, your body begins to lose the game. The sweat that emerges from your pores, that beautiful, elegant cooling system that works so well on a desert world or a humid afternoon on a temperate world, becomes almost useless because the air around you is so hot that sweat evaporates too quickly to cool anything effectively. More precisely, the air is so saturated with heat and with volcanic ash that evaporative cooling, the mechanism your body relies on absolutely, begins to fail. Within the first few minutes, your core temperature begins to climb. This is hypothermia, and it is not a gentle process. At 38 degrees, you begin to feel deeply uncomfortable, confused. At 39 degrees, your cognitive function starts to deteriorate. Your thinking becomes cloudy, your judgment unreliable. At 40 degrees, heat stroke begins. Your body's internal thermometer loses its calibration. The mechanisms that normally cool you cease to function properly, and a cascade begins that ends, almost always, in death. But you are not reaching 40 degrees sitting in relative safety. You are reaching it while standing on a world where the ground beneath you is hundreds of degrees hotter than that, where the air you are breathing is an oven, where every breath is drawing superheated gas into lungs designed for far gentler work. I think it's worth sitting with what this actually means. Your body is not a machine that can be adjusted or improved beyond certain tolerances. It is a thing that evolved on a specific kind of world, under specific conditions, and those conditions are not present on Mustafar. Your skin is perhaps the first casualty, because your skin is exposed, and your skin is remarkably sensitive to heat damage. Thermal burns happen quickly at extreme temperatures, much more quickly than most people realize. In air heated to 65 degrees Celsius, skin can be damaged within 2 minutes. Mustafar's ambient heat, close to lava flows, is several times that temperature. The radiant heat alone, the energy pouring off the molten rock, is enough to cause what are called radiant burns, damage to the outer layers of your skin caused by thermal radiation rather than direct contact. These burns begin as redness, progress to blistering, and very quickly become open wounds where the protective barrier of your skin has been breached. Those wounds, once opened, begin to lose moisture and heat in ways that accelerate your deterioration. Your lungs, meanwhile, are having their own crisis. Mustafar's atmosphere is technically breathable. It contains oxygen, which is remarkable given the planet's extreme nature, but it is not breathable in any meaningful sense for a human being. The air is laden with volcanic ash, fine particles of rock and mineral so small that they penetrate deeply into the lungs when you breathe them in, lodge in the delicate tissues of the bronchioles and alveoli, the tiny air sacs where gas exchange happens. These particles do not dissolve. They accumulate, they scratch, they scar the tissue they land on. Simultaneously, the air is rich in volcanic gases, sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, compounds that have their own effects on your physiology. Sulfur dioxide is particularly aggressive. It dissolves in the moisture of your respiratory tract, forming sulfurous acid, which burns the tissues it touches. You experience this as a tightening in your chest, a searing pain with each breath, as if you are inhaling fire. Your body responds by restricting your airways, by triggering a kind of protective spasm that actually makes it harder to breathe, which means you are drawing in less oxygen at precisely the moment your body needs more of it. The combination of ash accumulation and chemical burn creates a progressive suffocation, not the sudden asphyxiation of drowning, but a tightening vice that makes each breath more labored than the last. There is also the matter of dehydration, which arrives quickly and becomes catastrophic. In Mustafar's ambient heat, your body loses water at an extraordinary rate through sweating, through the simple evaporation of moisture from every surface, through breathing in air so dry that it pulls water from your respiratory tract with each inhalation. Within the first 30 or 40 minutes, without fluid replacement, your blood plasma volume begins to shrink, which means your cardiovascular system has less fluid to pump, which means your heart has to work harder to deliver oxygen to your tissues at the exact moment those tissues are being cooked from the inside and outside simultaneously. The stress on your cardiovascular system is immense and accelerating. Your heart rate climbs. A normal resting pulse of 60 or 70 beats per minute may double or triple within an hour, as your body tries desperately to maintain circulation, to deliver oxygen, to cool itself, to do all of these things at once in an environment that makes all of them increasingly impossible. Eventually, the heart itself begins to fail under the strain. There is something I find myself thinking about often in relation to all of this. The human body is not designed with a failsafe for environments like this. It has no shutdown sequence, no gradual degradation that gives you time to escape or adjust. Instead, failure is progressive and accelerating. Each system's collapse makes the next system's job harder, which makes it fail faster, which cascades into the others. It is a process that gathers speed as it goes. And I think that is the thing worth understanding about Mustafar. It is not that the planet is simply hotter than humans can tolerate, the way a desert is hot or a furnace is hot. It is that Mustafar is so far outside the envelope of human survivability that the body does not have time to adapt or adjust or even to die slowly. It simply fails in sequence, and that failure was built into the moment you arrived. The only thing that stood between the people who worked on Mustafar and this cascade of catastrophe was technology: suits, helmets, cooling systems, air filters, the armor between the body and a world that had no use for bodies at all. Now I want to turn to something more precise: the actual temperature, and what it means to speak of a world where the surface itself is hot enough to melt steel. So we come now to something that moves slower than heat, that does not burn so much as it eats, and that a human being cannot see coming until it is already inside them: the air itself. The atmosphere of Mustafar is not merely hot, it is a composition of poisons, the exhalation of a world in permanent volcanic convulsion. Sulfur dioxide rises constantly from the lava vents and fissures, a colorless gas with a sharp, acrid smell that reaches the back of your throat like a hand. Hydrogen sulfide billows from deeper within the crust, smelling like decay, like the inside of a tomb that has been sealed for centuries. Hydrogen chloride drifts upward in thin, invisible currents, and there is also carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide and fine particulate ash that hangs in the air like a veil between you and the landscape beyond. What you are breathing, in other words, is not air at all. It is the slow exhalation of a world being unmade and remade at its core. When a human being takes that first unprotected breath on Mustafar, several things happen almost simultaneously, and I want to dwell on them a moment because this is where the temperature stops being the only thing trying to kill you. The sulfur dioxide reaches the mucous membranes of the nose and mouth first, and it begins to dissolve there, forming sulfurous acid in the moisture of your breath. Within seconds, not minutes, seconds, there is pain, sharp and immediate, as those membranes begin to burn. Your eyes water reflexively, a response so quick it happens before conscious thought, and the tears themselves become acidic as the sulfur dioxide dissolves in them. The body knows something is wrong and tries to protect itself by producing more moisture, more tears, more mucus. But in doing so, it is making its own situation worse, because it is creating more medium for the poison to dissolve into. You begin to cough, another reflex, a desperate attempt to clear the airway, but the coughing brings more of the toxic gas deeper into your lungs. This is the terrible logic of Mustafar's air. Your own body's defenses against one form of poison make you more vulnerable to the next. The hydrogen sulfide, that grave smell gas, is moving deeper still, past your nose and mouth, down into the bronchial tubes that branch throughout your lungs like the tributaries of a river system. Here it is doing something different than the sulfur dioxide, something more fundamental. Hydrogen sulfide is a compound that interferes directly with the mechanism by which your cells produce energy, with the mitochondria's ability to use oxygen to create the chemical energy the body runs on. To oversimplify only slightly, your cells begin to suffocate even as you are breathing. Your body's oxygen sensors, the chemoreceptors that measure how much oxygen is in your blood and signal to your brain to breathe deeper, begin to trigger in alarm. You hyperventilate, drawing more of the toxic air deeper into your lungs, flooding your airways and alveoli with hydrogen sulfide, and the poisoning accelerates. At the same time, your heart is beginning to struggle because the poisons are disrupting not just your cellular energy production, but your heart's electrical rhythm itself. The sulfuric and hydrochloric compounds are also beginning to damage the delicate epithelial lining of your lungs, the gossamer layer of cells whose only job is to allow oxygen to cross from air into blood. As this lining is burned away, two things are happening. First, the oxygen that does manage to reach your bloodstream has a harder time crossing that burned tissue, so the poisoning of your cells accelerates further. And second, the damage itself causes swelling, inflammation, as your immune system recognizes that you are being burned from the inside and tries to wall off the damage. This swelling closes your airways further, making each breath more difficult, making you draw even deeper, more desperate breaths of the poison that is killing you. The miners who worked Mustafar, the Skakun engineers overseen by Wat Tamba, the Mustafarian laborers, the human soldiers and overseers who rotated through during the Clone Wars, all of them understood this mechanism intimately, not from learning it in a classroom, but from understanding, at a bone-deep level, that the air itself was an adversary that required respect and protection. They wore respirators, masks with filters designed to catch particulate and chemical absorbance, that would neutralize the gases before they reached the lungs. These were not comfortable. They were heavy, they restricted breathing. They had to be replaced regularly because the absorbent compounds had a finite capacity before they became saturated with poison and useless. But they were the only barrier between a human being and the slow suffocation of the body's own defenses being used against it. I find myself thinking about the people who worked on Mustafar without those protections, or with protections that failed, and what it means that their suffering was, to the techno-union, to the war effort, to the machinery of ambition and resource extraction, an acceptable cost of doing business. There's something in the way that Mustafar's atmosphere is not just hostile, but actively complicit. The way it turns your own body's emergency responses into mechanisms of its own destruction, that seems almost intentional, as though the planet itself is not merely indifferent to your survival, but actively, systematically opposed to it. The Mustafarians, of course, evolved in this atmosphere, their respiratory systems adapted to process these compounds, their lungs built with chambers and tissues that can withstand what would devastate a human. Watching them move through air that was poisoned to off-worlders, breathing what would kill an outsider within minutes, makes clear that survival on Mustafar is not a matter of courage or will or technology alone. It is a matter of being fundamentally suited to the place. The air of Mustafar did not develop as a hazard to be overcome, the way one might think of a mountain to be climbed or an ocean to be crossed. It developed as the fundamental condition of the world, and it remains the great invisible killer, not dramatic like a lava river, not sudden like thermal collapse, but patient, insidious, the slow dissolution of the delicate machinery of breath. Before we talk about what happens inside the body when the pressure changes, I want you to understand something that might not be immediately obvious. Pressure and temperature are not the same thing, and a world can kill you with one while leaving the other almost merciful. The human body is, in a sense, a vessel, a container built to hold itself together at a certain pressure, the pressure of an Earth-like atmosphere, roughly 1 bar, the weight of air pressing down from above in a way we stop noticing the moment we're born into it. On Mustafar, that pressure is not constant, and it is not merciful, and it operates according to rules that have very little to do with what your body evolved to expect. The southern hemisphere, where most of the mining facilities were built, sits in what the techno-union engineers called a pressure depression, a valley of sorts in the atmosphere itself, where volcanic outgassing and the way the thermal currents move creates pockets where the air grows dense, heavier than it should be. In those places, the atmospheric pressure can reach nearly 2.5 bars, more than double what a human body is built to withstand in any comfort, and more than double what it is built to survive without progressive physiological breakdown. To understand what that means, you have to understand that your body is not a solid thing. It is a series of pressurized systems in constant negotiation with the world outside. Your blood vessels hold themselves open by a careful balance, the pressure inside pushing outward, the pressure outside pushing inward, and when one side of that equation changes suddenly, the vessel does not hold, it ruptures. Your sinuses are chambers of air at a certain pressure, sealed with membranes that are impossibly delicate, designed for the world you were born into, not for the world that lies beneath a sky of volcanic ash and competing gravitational forces. Your lungs are sacs, millions of them, each one a tiny balloon of tissue that exchanges oxygen for carbon dioxide by relying on a precise pressure gradient between the air you breathe and the blood vessels that surround them. The Mustafarian workers, the ones who rode lava, fleas into the mining zones and extracted rare minerals by hand in conditions that would have horrified any humanitarian observer. They knew this in their bodies, even if they did not have a word for it. What they experienced, and what any human foolish enough to stand unprotected on Mustafar's surface would experience, is something the medical texts call barotrauma, which is a very clinical word for the body tearing itself apart from the inside because the pressure around it has changed. It happens in stages, and I think it is worth dwelling on each one, because this is not a quick death. It is a slow, cascade failure of the systems that hold you together. In the first moments, as you breathe the high-pressure air, the extra density of it fills your lungs more completely than they expect, and the delicate membranes that separate the air sacs from your blood vessels begin to swell under the pressure differential. Oxygen enters the bloodstream faster than it should. Nitrogen, which your body usually ignores, begins to dissolve into your tissues in concentrations that are not supposed to happen. And as it does, something strange happens to your nerves, a kind of narcosis, a numbing of thought and judgment that divers know well and call nitrogen narcosis. At pressures like those on Mustafar, this effect would arrive quickly and with a kind of awful clarity. A sense of heaviness in your limbs, a slowing of thought, a dangerous euphoria that would convince you that everything was fine even as your body began to come apart. But that is only the beginning, because your sinuses cannot equalize the pressure. The eustachian tubes that connect them to your throat are narrow, and they cannot open fast enough to let the dense air in, and so a pressure differential forms, and the membranes in your sinuses rupture, and blood begins to seep from your nose and your ears. This is called sinus barotrauma, and it is not immediately lethal, but it is immediately agonizing, and it signals that your body is now in active conflict with the pressure around it. The pain is sharp and deep, centered in your face, a sensation of bursting that is not a metaphor but a description. Tissues are literally rupturing because the pressure inside does not match the pressure outside. Your blood vessels, meanwhile, are beginning their own reckoning with the change in pressure around them, and they do not have the luxury that your sinuses do of being somewhat redundant. Your circulatory system cannot partially fail. It must function, or you must die. The pressure pushing inward on every blood vessel in your body increases the load on your heart, which now must work harder to push blood outward against that resistance. And the oxygen-rich blood that your body depends on moves through your tissues more slowly because the pressure gradient that usually drives it has changed. At the same time, your veins, the vessels that carry blood back to your heart, face the opposite problem. The increased external pressure squeezes them, reducing their volume, and the venous return to your heart becomes sluggish, and your heart compensates by beating faster and harder, and what you experience is a crushing sensation in your chest, a panic that belongs to the body and rises up into consciousness, whether you will it or not. The workers wore suits to counteract this, pressurized exoskeletons that maintained an internal pressure closer to what their bodies expected, though even these suits were imperfect. The joints where the suit moved and the limbs extended were places where the pressure differential remained, where the body's knowledge of pain remained acute. I think about what it must have meant to wear one of those suits, day after day, knowing that the only thing between your body and rupture was a piece of technology that was itself breaking down in the corrosive environment, its seals degrading, its pressure regulators working harder and harder to keep the difference between inside and outside manageable. What makes the pressure problem particularly cruel is that you cannot see it. You cannot watch it happening the way you can watch your skin burn in thermal radiation or feel your lungs fill with toxic ash. It is happening inside you, to the structures that hold you together, and the first signs, the heaviness, the euphoria, the slow numbing of judgment, make you less capable of recognizing that you are being unmade, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, moment by moment. The Mustafarians, whose biology was shaped by generations of living on this world, have sinuses that seal differently, blood vessels that tolerate pressure gradients more patiently, a circulatory system that operates under principles that we do not fully understand. They survived pressure on Mustafar the way they survived temperature and poison, by being something other than human, by carrying in their bodies the answer to questions that were written into the world itself. For everyone else, for the clone soldiers who were sometimes sent down to secure the mining facilities, for the Skakun engineers of the Techno Union, for any human foolish enough to believe their body could withstand what a planet demanded, the pressure was just one more layer of no, one more system of the world rejecting them, one more way that Mustafar enforced its ancient rule. This world was not made for you, and it will prove that to you systematically until you understand. It is perhaps one of the cruelest equations in all of galactic history. That Mustafar's very hostility made it valuable, and its value drew people who would almost certainly die there. We know their names now, many of them, recovered from records and logs, and the accounts that survived the Clone Wars. Soldiers and engineers and miners who understood exactly what they were walking into and went anyway. Let us begin with the miners, the workers whose records are the oldest and most abundant because they have been going to Mustafar the longest. Long before the separatists, long before the Techno-Union's industrial gamble, there were beings, desperate, ambitious, poor, who calculated that the rarity of Mustafar's minerals was worth the statistical certainty of their own shortened life. The records from these early operations are fragmentary, written in shipping manifests and mining reports that treat human death as a line item in a ledger. But the pattern is unmistakable. A miner would typically last somewhere between 2 and 5 years of continuous exposure before their cumulative damage became acute enough that transport off-world was necessary. Some lasted longer, but those were anomalies, and the reports noted this with a kind of bewildered tone, as if survival itself was a variable that could not quite be explained. What emerges from reading these accounts is a picture of people who understood perfectly well that they were being slowly poisoned, burned, pressurized into failure, and who continued the work because the alternative was poverty that was, in its own way, as slow and final as Mustafar's hostility. We tend to think of survival as a binary thing, but the mining records tell a different story. Survival was a negotiation, a series of trade-offs between immediate wages and deferred death. When the Techno-Union arrived, when Wat Tambor and his Skakon engineers began the industrial-scale extraction, something shifted in the nature of the hazard. Tambor himself could not breathe any atmosphere but his own. He required a suit even indoors on most worlds, and so his operations were characterized by a peculiar kind of distance from the actual conditions his workers faced. He could theorize the danger without living in it. What he built was the Klega Corp mining facility, massive reinforced structures cut directly into Mustafar's volcanic rock, with collection arms extending over rivers of lava, designed to process mineral wealth at a scale that previous operations had never attempted. The records from this period become more abundant, more detailed, because the Separatists and the Commerce Guild, entities with resources to document their operations, kept careful records of their industrial machinery, if not of their workers' actual experience. But embedded in these records, if you know how to read them, is a different kind of account. The engineering specifications for life support systems, the maintenance logs for respirators, the medical reports that catalogue the progression of lava lung and thermal burns and barotrauma in a way that feels almost administrative in its precision. A report from 17 BBY notes that respirator effectiveness degraded approximately 3% per month under continuous use, meaning that a worker's margin of safety narrowed measurably with each passing week, each filter becoming less efficient, the toxic atmosphere finding its way in more insistently. Clone soldiers, too, came to Mustafar, though in smaller numbers and for shorter deployments. The Republic and later, the Empire understood that Mustafar was not a place where you could sustain a garrison indefinitely. What we have from the Clone War records are operation summaries, security briefings, and notably, a series of casualty reports that cluster around the phrase hazardous environment protocols exceeded, in a way that suggests the military was documenting environmental rather than combat deaths. There are accounts of clone troopers arriving at the Klega facility in 19 BBY during the final days of the separatist holdout, and the logs suggest a certain grim efficiency. The soldiers understood they were operating in conditions that would kill them relatively quickly, and so their time on Mustafar was measured in hours or days rather than deployments. The irony, which the records do not explicitly state, but which hovers underneath them, is that the soldiers who came to Mustafar during the Clone Wars were themselves already being pushed toward their own extinction. Clones age at twice the rate of natural-born humans, their bodies designed to burn bright and briefly. And to ask them to operate on a world designed to incinerate them was to simply accelerate a process that was already underway. There is an account, fragmentary but vivid, from a clone trooper named CT-5597, though the record calls him by his designation alone, because personhood was something the clone system was not designed to grant. Describing a patrol of the mining complex, in which the trooper notes that his armor's cooling systems could not keep pace with the radiative heat, and that he was rotating between duty posts every 15 minutes to prevent heat stroke. Which meant that on a world where everything was trying to kill him, the primary question was not whether he would survive the day, but rather how he would manage to be useful for the time he had. That record ends there, unmarked without follow-up, which itself is a kind of information. The Mustafarians, by contrast, move through these records as a kind of incomprehensible fact. They simply survived where others did not, riding lava fleas into terrain that would char an unarmored human within minutes, their biology so different from standard carbon-based humanoids that the engineers seem to regard them as a kind of terrain feature, a resource to be deployed rather than workers to be preserved. The engineers built their minds around the Mustafarians' capabilities, designing collection apparatus that Mustafarians could access where pressurized equipment was insufficient, where human workers in even the most advanced suits could not reach, and the documents refer to these operations with the same bureaucratic tone they used for everything else. But there is something in that neutrality that makes it somehow worse. By the late Clone Wars, as the separatist leadership realized their position was collapsing, Mustafar became not just a mining operation, but a shelter, a last refuge hidden in a hellscape, because Wat Tambor and the others understood that no one would willingly pursue them there. The Separatist Council was moved to the Klega facility itself. Newt Gunray, Shu Mai, San Hill, Po Nudo, the assembled leadership of the Confederacy, all of them sitting deep in Mustafar's poisoned air, behind reinforced stone and technologically enhanced life support, waiting for rescue that would never come. And then Anakin Skywalker arrived, walked into that facility with the certainty of the Force guiding him, and in the space of an afternoon, ended the entire Separatist Council, one leader at a time, in a corridor underground where Mustafar's hostility was replaced by a different kind of finality. What is remarkable about the accounts from those final hours is how little the environment itself factored into the narrative. The facility's life support held, the doors remained sealed, and the deaths that occurred were administered by a single person, methodical and precise, in a place that had been designed as a refuge but became instead a tomb. Afterwards, for years, Mustafar was left largely to the Techno-Union's automated operations, its minerals continuing to be extracted, its conditions continuing to be utterly lethal. And then Darth Vader returned, drawn not to the industrial machinery, but to the dark side vergence deep beneath the planet's surface, the ancient Sith presence that had waited in the lava and stone for someone like him to claim it. He built a fortress there, over the tuning fork focus that channeled dark side energy, a structure designed by an architect whose consciousness had been preserved in an ancient mask, and he made Mustafar his own in a way that no miner or soldier or separatist leader ever could. In doing so, he transformed the planet once again, from a place where people went because they had no choice, or because they were chasing profit, or because they had lost, into a place where one person went because the darkness itself called to him. And in that transformation lies perhaps the deepest truth about Mustafar, that it is not the temperature that makes it lethal, not the atmosphere, not the pressure, but something older and more fundamental, a convergence of hostile matter and hostile spirit that rejects life itself in every form. And here is where the story turns toward human ingenuity, because there is something quietly profound in the way that people, knowing a place will kill them, choose to go there anyway, and in doing so, invent the very tools that make survival possible. For centuries, anyone who ventured onto Mustafar's surface faced a simple fact. The planet demanded more of the body than the body could give. Temperature, atmosphere, pressure. Each one alone was enough to end a human life in minutes, and together they created a synergy of hostility that seemed absolute, unyielding. Yet the minerals buried beneath that inferno were valuable enough, rare enough, that people kept returning, kept trying, kept dying, and kept imagining that next time they might find a way. The earliest mining operations, we know from the records, used almost nothing. Workers in heavy cloth that caught fire. Workers wearing masks of leather and cloth soaked in water that boiled away. Workers trusting their own tolerance and discovering its limits too late. Some of those miners lasted years, others lasted weeks. The Mustafarians, of course, needed far less. Their bodies had evolved across generations to withstand what would unmake any other species, to ride their lava fleas across rivers of liquid rock, to move through superheated air as though it were merely a warm afternoon on some gentler world. They wore clothing, yes, but it was meant to protect them from the mechanical hazards, the sharp obsidian, the sudden eruptions, not from the environment itself. Their own physiology was the suit. But outsiders could not afford to wait for evolution. In the pre-Republic era, as mining intensified, engineers began experimenting with layered fabrics, with metal plates to distribute and reflect heat, with simple respirators filled with cool water vapor to protect the lungs from the worst of the toxic gases. It was crude, and it worked poorly, and it bought people a few more minutes on the surface, minutes that might mean the difference between extracting ore and dying in the attempt. By the time the Techno-Union took control of Mustafar, centuries later, the technology had evolved considerably. Wat Tamba, the Skakun engineer and head of the Techno-Union, understood industrial efficiency and resource extraction. He also understood, in a visceral way, what it meant to need specialized equipment just to breathe. Because as a Skakun, he could not breathe the air of any world but his own, and his own specially pressurized suit was as essential to him as lungs to any other being. There is something almost poignant in that detail, that the man who would drive the industrial exploitation of Mustafar knew intimately what it meant to be dependent on a suit, to trust your life to the seals and the filters and the mechanisms that stood between you and a hostile world. The mining suits that the Techno-Union developed during the Clone Wars were not elegant, but they were effective. They were heavy, layered constructs with outer shells of heat-resistant alloys, designed to reflect and dissipate thermal radiation away from the body. The inner layers were insulating materials that slowed the transfer of heat inward, creating a thin zone of survivability around the wearer. The suits were sealed, with recirculation systems that cooled air pulled from the surface and filtered it through chemical beds that removed the worst of the sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide before it reached the lungs. The filters themselves needed constant replacement. A shift on Mustafar's surface could render them useless, clogged with ash and compound vapors, and a worker whose suit lost filtration lost consciousness, and then life within minutes. There was also, critically, the pressure regulation system. In the southern mining regions, where the atmospheric pressure climbed to nearly 2.5 bars, more than double what a human body evolved to withstand, the suits maintained internal pressure at sustainable levels, relieving the crushing stress on sinuses, on eardrums, on the delicate pressure gradients that allowed blood to flow. Workers described the sensation of suiting up as a kind of entombment, but it was an entombment that permitted life. And life, after all, was the entire point. The suits themselves, however, introduced a new set of dangers that are worth sitting with a moment, because they represent a fundamental paradox of survival in an unsurvivable place. A mining suit required constant maintenance. Every seal had to hold perfectly, every filter had to be replaced on schedule, every pressure valve had to remain uncorroded and functional. The suits were designed to be repaired and reused, and they were across hundreds of mining cycles. But each repair was a potential failure point, Each reuse a slow degradation of the materials that kept the wearer alive. There are administrative records from the Techno-Union's operations that document, in dry bureaucratic language, the failure rates of the suits. Suit rupture during a 7-hour shift, seal failure at the wrist joint, pressure regulator malfunction leading to nitrogen narcosis, and loss of consciousness. Some workers survived those failures, others did not. And then there was the simple fact of fatigue and heat-related degradation of human cognition. Even in a properly functioning suit, a worker on Mustafar's surface was constantly losing fluids through perspiration, constantly under stress from the remnant heat that penetrated even the best seals, constantly aware on some primitive level that everything surrounding them wanted them dead. Decision-making suffered, fine motor control suffered, the ability to recognize that a suit seal was beginning to fail, to notice the subtle whistle of air escaping, to pull yourself towards safety, all of it became harder the longer you stayed outside. The records document workers who remained at their stations past the point of safety, trying to extract just a few more units of ore, trying to complete their quota, because pulling back early meant reduced rations, meant reassignment, meant becoming someone the Techno-Union deemed inefficient. And so the suits protected the body, while the system exploited the will. What strikes me most, looking back at this period, is the effort required, the sheer stubborn human determination to engineer a way to survive the unsurvivable. For all the profound hostility of Mustafar, the lava, the toxins, the pressure, the heat that has no mercy and no end, someone, somewhere, looked at the problem and refused to accept it as unsolvable. They invented the layered suit, the filter system, the pressure regulator, the cooling circulation. They failed repeatedly, and they tried again. It is a kind of courage, I think, though not the kind that tends to be celebrated, not the courage to face an enemy in combat, but the courage to face a planet, to admit its power over you, and to find ways to persist despite that power. The Mustafarians, of course, never needed to invent any of this. Their bodies were solution and suit in one, and in that fact lies something we will circle back to as this story deepens. The question of what it means to be truly adapted to a place, and whether that adaptation is something to be envied or feared. But for now, let us simply note that by the time Wat Tamba's mining operations reached their peak, the Techno-Union had created a layer of technology, imperfect and constantly failing, that permitted off-worlders to survive on Mustafar for hours, sometimes days, before exhaustion and equipment failure forced them to evacuate or die trying. This suit revolution did not make Mustafar survivable. It made Mustafar exploitable. And that distinction, I find, matters more than we might initially think. An unprotected human stands on Mustafar's surface, breathing the air of the world for the first time without armor or respirator, and already, within the first seconds, the cascade has begun. The heat hits first, not as temperature alone, but as a presence, a weight in the air that presses against the skin like something physical, like standing inside a furnace that extends in every direction to the horizon. The thermal radiation from the lava rivers and the superheated rock beneath the feet begins immediately to excite the molecules in exposed skin, and within moments that excitation registers as pain, a burning that starts on the surface and deepens. 60 minutes on Mustafar without protection is not a slow decline. It is a series of overlapping failures, each one accelerating the next, each system of the body betraying the others as Mustafar's systematic rejection of human life unfolds. Let us walk through it carefully, step by step, because what happens in that hour is written in the physiology of anyone brave or foolish enough to remain unarmored on that world. At T0, the moment the visor opens, the lungs draw in what they believe will be air and encounter instead a soup of sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, and volcanic ash so fine it penetrates the deepest passages of the respiratory system. The sulfur compounds bind immediately to the moisture in the nasal passages and throat, forming acidic compounds that burn the mucous membranes like nothing the body has encountered before. Not fire, not chemical exposure, but a burning that feels like the tissues themselves are being remade. The body's first reflex, to cough, to expel the poisoned air, is almost merciful in its uselessness. Coughing only draws more of it deeper, only accelerates the inflammation that is already beginning to swell the throat and narrow the airways. The eyes, exposed to the ash and the sulfurous haze, begin to water uncontrollably, tears streaming as the body tries desperately to wash away particulates that cannot be washed away, that settle instead into the tear ducts and the delicate tissue of the eyelids. By 30 seconds, the skin on the exposed face and hands is beginning to feel not warm but actively hot, the radiant energy from the lava rivers pouring across the landscape carrying heat that the body has no mechanism to shed. At 1 minute, the core body temperature has begun to rise measurably, and the cardiovascular system, which evolved to cool itself by moving blood to the skin and radiating heat into air far cooler than Mustafar, finds itself in an impossible situation. There is nowhere for the heat to go. The body, recognizing the danger, begins to sweat, a response that on Mustafar is worse than useless. In ambient temperatures exceeding 700 degrees on the hardened rock, sweat evaporates so instantly that it offers no cooling whatsoever, only rapid dehydration that begins immediately to stress every system, depending on blood volume and electrolyte balance. 5 minutes in, the throat has swollen noticeably. The act of breathing has become consciously difficult, and the lungs themselves, tissue designed to interface with oxygen, not with corrosive volcanic gas, are beginning the process of inflammation that will narrow the bronchial passages and make every subsequent breath more labored than the last. The skin, by this point, has begun to show visible burns on any surface that faced the lava fields directly. The burns are not blistering yet, but the redness is deep and spreading, and the pain is becoming a constant presence that demands more and more of the brain's processing power simply to acknowledge. At 10 minutes, something critical is beginning to happen in the cardiovascular system. The combination of extreme heat, dehydration from evaporated sweat, and the body's desperate attempt to cool itself through continued blood flow to the skin has begun to deplete the central blood volume, and blood pressure, which should be climbing as the heart compensates, is instead beginning to drop. The body is heating faster than it can cool, and the temperature differential between the extreme environment and the core is so great that the physics themselves are working against survival. There is no vest or suit of armor in the chapter we just completed that did not have active cooling systems, not passive shielding, but constant circulation of coolant to fight the heat with something other than sweat. 20 minutes without such protection, and the lungs are badly inflamed. The throat is swollen enough that swallowing has become painful, and the mucous membranes lining the respiratory system have begun to slough off, a process that will eventually block the airways with necrotic tissue and the body's own inflammatory response. The skin is showing blistering now, particularly on the shoulders and the back of the neck, places where the sun of Mustafar's star and the radiant heat from the lava combine to exceed what tissue can endure. The pain has transitioned from acute to something more comprehensive, a burning that encompasses the entire surface of the body. Dehydration is severe by this point. The lips are cracked and bleeding, the mouth is dry beyond the ability to produce saliva, and the electrolytes lost to the constant evaporative sweat are beginning to cause muscle cramps and tremors in the extremities. At 30 minutes, heat exhaustion is setting in with genuine force. The body temperature is approaching 40 degrees Celsius, and the symptoms are becoming undeniable. Disorientation, difficulty concentrating, a kind of detached unreality settling over thought itself. The nasal passages are completely blocked now by inflammatory swelling and by the accumulated ash and fluid from the body's immune response. Breathing has transitioned entirely to mouth breathing, which means the toxic gases are no longer filtered even poorly by the nasal passages, but are moving directly into the lungs with every breath. The cardiovascular stress is becoming critical. The heart is working at maximum capacity to circulate blood to the skin in a desperate attempt at cooling. And the combination of that effort, the heat damage accumulating in the myocardium itself, and the progressively lower blood volume is beginning to create a situation in which the heart's ability to function is being fundamentally compromised. 45 minutes, and consciousness itself is becoming unstable. There is still awareness, still the capacity to understand what is happening, but it is fragmentary, interrupted, like watching something through a failing broadcast signal. The burns across the body are deep now, the blistering extensive, and beneath the blisters the tissue is being damaged by sustained temperatures that no human tissue was ever meant to endure. The pain, which was so overwhelming in the first 20 minutes, has begun to fade in some places as the nerves themselves are damaged and cease transmitting. By 55 minutes, the core temperature has likely crossed 41 degrees Celsius, genuine heat stroke territory, and the body's regulatory systems, already overwhelmed, are beginning to fail in cascading ways. Muscle breakdown is occurring, proteins are beginning to denature, the kidney is beginning to fail as dehydration becomes profound. The respiratory system is no longer a limiting factor because the heart and brain are failing faster. The lungs are still inflamed, the throat is still swollen, but the body is dying from multiple causes simultaneously. Not one slow poison, but several fast ones, all reaching critical failure at roughly the same moment. At 60 minutes exactly, a human being would still be conscious. Barely, but profoundly altered, disoriented beyond the capacity for purposeful action. The body running on systems designed for survival on 1,000 different worlds, but not this one, not Mustafar. A world that does not want you here and has been saying so with complete clarity for an entire hour. And this is the thing I want you to understand. That hour is not the end. It is barely the beginning of what Mustafar would do to you if you remained. The miners we read about in the records, the ones whose employment lasted 2 to 5 years before cumulative damage forced evacuation, did not survive that way through strength or through luck. They survived through the suits, through the active cooling systems pumping frigid coolant through layered mesh, through the respirators filtering every breath, through the pressure regulators holding back the crushing atmospheric weight. Without those systems, without that constant technological intervention, there is no survival. Not for an hour, not for a day, not for anything beyond the time it takes for the multiple systems of the body to fail simultaneously under conditions that are, quite simply, beyond the threshold of human tolerance. What Mustafar was designed for, what Mustafar evolved to demand, is not human life, but something else entirely. At the very end of the Clone Wars, when the fighting had lasted so long that its end seemed like a kind of abstract concept rather than something that could actually occur, Palpatine sent word to the surviving leaders of the separatist movement that they should retreat to Mustafar, where they would be safe, where the war could be concluded on terms favorable to them. They believed him, which I think tells you something about how exhausted the galaxy had become. The will to doubt had worn thin. Newt Gunray, the viceroy of the Trade Federation, arrived with Rune Harko and the others. Wat Tambor, the Skakon whose very existence depended on the machines that kept him alive. San Hill of the intergalactic banking clan, Shu Mai of the Commerce Guild, minor leaders and administrators whose names would disappear from historical records almost immediately. They gathered in the command center of the Klega Corp mining facility, built years before deep into Mustafar's volcanic rock, surrounded by the very infrastructure that had made the planet valuable enough to fight over. The facility hummed with the sound of machinery and the distant rumble of geological forces, lava rivers visible through the reinforced transparisteel windows, a reminder that they were sitting on the skin of a world that was actively trying to kill everything on it. And then Darth Vader arrived. This was his first assignment as a Sith Lord, fresh from the temple, fresh from executing the Jedi Order alongside the clone troopers, from the screams of the children in the halls of what had been the center of the Jedi Order for 1,000 years. He was no longer Anakin Skywalker. That person had been burned away in the fires of his own choice, replaced by something harder, something that moved through the world with a kind of perfect clarity. The separatist leaders did not see Vader as their executioner when he entered the room. I think, in some sense, they were incapable of seeing him that way. Gunray, the man whose ambitions and political maneuvering had set so much of this war in motion, looked at him and apparently believed that his role as a major player in the galaxy's events meant something, that his life still held a kind of weight. He tried to negotiate. He said the war was over, that there was no need for further violence, that they could come to some arrangement. And Vader, moving through the room with a methodical precision that was not anger but something colder, killed every one of them. Newt Gunray, who had sent his battleships to blockade Naboo more than a decade earlier, who had set Anakin Skywalker and Padme Amidala on a collision course with each other and with destiny itself, died pleading for mercy on Mustafar. One by one, the council of the separatist movement fell in the Klega facility, their bodies collapsing in a room where so many decisions about the deployment of industrial resources and droid armies had been made in the careful, impersonal language of commerce. And somewhere in the wider galaxy, the signal went out to deactivate the droid armies, and the Clone Wars ended, not with a treaty or a surrender ceremony, but with a quiet electrical pulse and the shutdown of countless mechanical soldiers. The war that had begun with the Trade Federation's blockade of Naboo, that had consumed millions of lives and reshaped the political order of the galaxy, that had been fought across hundreds of worlds and cost an entire generation of young men their existence, simply stopped. I think there's something almost unbearable about that detail, not the killing of the Separatist Council, which was cold and strategic and completed its purpose, but the fact that the war itself did not end with the kind of finality you might expect. There was no great battle, no climactic moment of military triumph. Instead, there was a young man who had once believed in freedom and justice, and the possibility of peace moving through a mining facility on a hostile world and erasing the people who had funded the other side's war machine. It was an ending that was perfectly efficient and perfectly obscene in its efficiency. But Mustafar was not finished with Anakin Skywalker. Padme Amidala followed him there aboard her Naboo skiff, and Obi-Wan Kenobi stowed away to watch, to bear witness to what his best friend had become, or perhaps to stop him if the opportunity arose. What happened next was not strategy or cold execution. It was something rawer, something that revealed what the transformation from man to Sith had actually cost. Anakin, seeing Padme with Obi-Wan, seeing betrayal where there was only love and desperation, and the impossibility of saving someone who no longer wished to be saved, moved toward her in rage. He took her by the throat and crushed it with the Force while Obi-Wan watched, unable to move, unable to stop it. This is the moment, I think, where the true horror of Mustafar crystallizes. The planet itself was always lethal, always a place that killed anything that tried to survive on it without the proper protection, without the proper adaptation, without constant vigilance and technological support. But what happened in those moments in the Klega facility was a different kind of lethality, the lethality of a young man destroying the person he loved, because he could not imagine a version of the future where she lived, and he was not in absolute control of her. Padme fell to the ground, her body broken by the Force, and Anakin left her there to face Obi-Wan. The duel that followed lasted long enough for them to move through the facility, across bridges spanning lava rivers, through corridors where the ground itself was unstable, where the boundaries between the human structures and the violent geology of Mustafar were not quite fixed. Obi-Wan had taught Anakin everything Anakin knew about lightsaber combat, and now he watched his student use that knowledge against him with a kind of desperate creativity, force and technique, pushing toward each other across platforms and through collapsing structures. In the end, Obi-Wan was higher, and Anakin was lower, and gravity and the river of lava burning below them made the rest irrelevant. Anakin's legs and his left arm fell away under Obi-Wan's lightsaber, and he was left burning, screaming, as Obi-Wan took his lightsaber and left him there to die on the banks of a river of molten rock on a world that had been trying to kill him since the moment his feet touched its surface. And yet he did not die. Palpatine came, as he had always known he would, and raised him from the edge of the lava and remade him into something else entirely. Not Anakin, not anymore, but Darth Vader, a being who would return to Mustafar decades later and build a fortress there, who would claim the planet as his own private hell and throne room combined, which is the final, terrible irony. Mustafar did not kill him because he no longer belonged fully to the life that Mustafar's conditions could kill. The planet's lethal nature, which had killed so many workers and miners across the centuries, which demanded constant protection and constant technology and constant vigilance, became almost irrelevant to a man who was no longer entirely human, who was mostly machine and dark side force manipulation, and the will to survive that came from pure, undiluted hatred. So Mustafar, in a sense, received what it had always been waiting for, not a victim, but a master. There is a moment in the long history of Mustafar when the planet ceases to be merely a hazard, a test of human endurance, a problem of temperature and atmosphere and pressure to be engineered around, and becomes something else entirely, a stage. On this particular afternoon, in 19 BBY, the lava rivers do not care what is about to happen above them. They flow as they have flowed for millions of years, indifferent to the machinery built into the rock, indifferent to the ambitions of the beings who mine its wealth and hide its refugees. But the men who know this world, or believe they know it, are about to learn that Mustafar's lethal nature is not the only thing that can kill. Anakin Skywalker arrives at the Klega Corp mining facility with the weight of a terrible new name, Darth Vader. He comes alone, a figure in dark robes moving through the control rooms and corridors where the Separatist Council has gathered in what they believe is safety, hiding from a war they thought Palpatine would protect them from. The Viceroy Newt Gunray is there, along with Wat Tambor, the Skakun engineer who built these facilities, who turned Mustafar into an engine of industrial war. Sanhil Shumai, the other architects of the Separatist cause, they are all here, alive and waiting and hopeful. In the space of minutes, Anakin kills them, one by one, his lightsaber moving with a precision that has nothing to do with the chaos of war. This is execution, methodical and cold, and when it is finished, the Separatist Council is dead. The droids of the Separatist military receive their deactivation order, and the Clone Wars, which have consumed the galaxy for 3 years, simply end. The war does not end in a final battle across 1,000 worlds. It ends in a mining facility on a hell world, in an act of murder disguised as victory. And then Padme arrives. She comes in her Naboo skiff, still convinced that somewhere inside the person Anakin has become, the man she loved is still present, still capable of hearing her. She carries no weapon, only the weight of belief that love might be enough to call him back from whatever darkness he has embraced. What Padme does not know is that Obi-Wan Kenobi has stowed away on her vessel, that he has seen the security footage from the Jedi Temple, that he knows what Anakin did to the younglings, the children, the small ones who had not yet grown into warriors, who could not have posed any threat. When Anakin sees Obi-Wan emerge from Padme's ship, something breaks in him that will never be repaired. He believes she has betrayed him, that she has brought his oldest friend to execute him, and in that terrible moment of misunderstanding, fueled by fear and rage, and the hunger of the dark side that now lives in his mind like a second heartbeat, he reaches out with the Force and closes his hand around her throat. Padme collapses, gasping, and Anakin turns to Obi-Wan with the full weight of his fury. There are very few moments in the long history of the Jedi and Sith, in all the centuries of conflict between light and dark, when two beings so closely matched in skill and strength are forced into opposition. Anakin was trained by Obi-Wan from boyhood, taught every technique, every discipline, every hard-won lesson that made Obi-Wan the greatest swordsman of his age. Obi-Wan trained him not as a student, but as a brother, and in doing so, he created a warrior whose raw potential exceeded his own. But potential and mastery are not the same thing, and Obi-Wan carries something Anakin does not. He carries the weight of knowing what he must do, and he has come to do it. The duel begins in the control rooms of the mining facility, lightsabers igniting in the darkness. Anakin's saber glowing red with its synthetic fury, Obi-Wan's blue a color that seems almost gentle against it. They move through the corridors and across the elevated walkways that span the lava rivers, structures built by beings who thought their engineering could create a permanent foothold in hell. As they fight, the facility itself becomes complicit in their confrontation. The platforms shake, the machinery strains, the delicate balance between the mining operation and the raw volcanic force beneath it destabilizes. One of the massive lava collection arms, a structure of reinforced metal and industrial ambition, designed to dip into molten rivers and extract their minerals, is struck by a falling piece of the duel, and it begins to collapse. Anakin and Obi-Wan leap from platform to droid to floating metal debris, their fight carrying them out over the lava itself, suspended above temperatures that would obliterate any unarmored being in seconds. For a moment, they stand together on a worker droid, surrounded by the inferno, heat radiating upward in waves, the sulfurous atmosphere churning around them, and yet they are so focused on the confrontation between them that Mustafar itself seems almost incidental. The duel is no longer about surviving the planet. Survival has become irrelevant. They move to the black sand banks of the lava river's edge, where the molten ground has cooled just enough to hold shape. It is here, in the shadow of a high embankment, that the moment comes that will haunt both of them for the rest of their lives. Obi-Wan retreats up the slope, his positioning giving him height and advantage, and he calls out to the man he trained, the brother he loved. "It's over, Anakin. I have the high ground." And in that instant, Anakin makes the choice that unmakes him. He leaps, defying the geometry of the moment, defying the warning, driven by rage and the conviction that his power is sufficient to overcome any obstacle, including the hard truth of physics and positioning. Obi-Wan's blue lightsaber moves once, a cut born from 3 decades of mastery, and Anakin's arm falls away, his legs severed at the knee. The young man, the boy really, for he is only 22 years old, slides down the embankment toward the lava, and the heat ignites his clothing, burns the exposed skin, and begins the work that Mustafar began preparing for the moment Anakin first arrived on its surface. Obi-Wan stands above him, breathing hard, and speaks the words that will define the rest of his exile. "You were the chosen one. It was said you would destroy the Sith, not join them." Anakin, burning, calls up at his former master, "I hate you." And Obi-Wan, his voice breaking, answers, "You were my brother, Anakin. I loved you." He takes the fallen lightsaber and turns away, unable to watch what comes next, unable to bear the weight of what he has just done. Padmé awakens confused and bleeding, and Obi-Wan carries her away from the facility, away from Mustafar, not knowing that the man he left to die is not actually dead, that somewhere in the unforgiving landscape of this hellworld, Palpatine's hand reaches down to pull him from the brink. The Mustafarian lava that should have been Anakin's ending becomes instead his transformation. What rises from it will no longer be the chosen one, the boy from the desert, the Jedi Master who believed in the light. What rises is something new, something that Mustafar has been waiting to birth since the moment it was formed in chaos between 2 hungry giants. The duel is over, but the story, terrible and immense, is only beginning. There is a moment, I think, when a place stops being only what it is and becomes what happened there, and I want to sit with that moment for a while, because it is the hinge on which Mustafar's entire legend turns. The Separatist Council had been promised safety on Mustafar, hidden in the deep facility that the Techno-Union had built into the volcanic rock. Newt Gunray of the Trade Federation, Wat Tamba still breathing his artificial atmosphere, Poggle the Lesser, Shu Mai, San Hill, and the others, all of them believing they had escaped the collapse of their armies and secured themselves in a stronghold that even the Republic's forces could not reach. They were wrong, of course, and their wrongness is part of what makes this moment matter so much. A young man arrived on Mustafar in the hours after Order 66, and he moved through that facility with a certainty that seemed to come from somewhere outside himself, as if he were a hand being moved by something vast and dark that dwelt behind his eyes. Anakin Skywalker, now Darth Vader in name if not yet in body, executed the entire council methodically, one by one, while they pleaded and bargained and tried to offer him things, credits, information, allegiance, as if the chosen one had not become something for which those words held no meaning anymore. And then, as his first act as a Sith apprentice, he sent a single command through the droid-controlled ship orbiting Mustafar, and across the galaxy, millions upon millions of battle droids simply stopped, their war processing units going dark, the clone wars ending not with a final victory, but with a switch being flipped by a boy who had lost everything and gained a title. There is something almost unbearably precise about that moment. The idea that the largest conflict in living memory, the thing that had consumed the Republic and shaped the lives of trillions, could be ended by a single signal sent from a mining complex on a world most of the galaxy had never heard of. But what made Mustafar eternal was not what Anakin did there. It was what the place did to him in return. Padme came searching for him. She had learned of his fall from Obi-Wan Kenobi, who had stowed away aboard her ship. And when Anakin emerged from the darkness of the facility and saw his former master step out onto the landing platform beside the woman he loved, something broke in him that had been holding together by the thinnest thread. He force-joked her into unconsciousness with a gesture, accusing her of betrayal, and in that moment, the chosen one, the boy whose mother had taught him that his capacity for love was his strength, became something that used love as a weapon against itself. Obi-Wan's eyes would have met his then, and I have to imagine that whatever Obi-Wan saw in his former apprentice, it was not the boy he had trained. The duel that followed ranged across the Mustafar mining complex like a reckoning, like the planet itself was watching to see if anything could survive being broken so completely. They fought across bridges suspended over lava rivers that had been flowing for millions of years before either of them was born, and the lava continued flowing beneath them, indifferent, as if to remind them both that there were forces older and larger than the Force, than destiny, than anything two men could do to each other. Obi-Wan gained the high ground on a volcanic bank, a simple fact of terrain, the kind of thing that decides most battles long before the fighting even begins. And he told Anakin not to try the leap, told him to stand down, told him there was still some choice left to make. Anakin leaped anyway. And I think that detail matters more than people sometimes understand, because it was the moment Anakin chose, truly chose, to be unmade rather than to surrender, to burn rather than to accept the mercy of mercy. The lightsaber cut came like a signature, and when Anakin fell toward the lava, his arm and both legs severed, his body already burning, he had accomplished something almost miraculous in its way. He had ensured that he could never go back. There was no recovery from this, no way for anyone to gather the pieces and make him whole again, no possibility of redemption or return, because Obi-Wan had taken his lightsaber and walked away, and the inferno of Mustafar was doing the rest. Except, of course, that was not the end of the story. Darth Sidious arrived on Mustafar and found his fallen apprentice at the edge of the lava, still breathing, still alive in a way that seemed to defy nature, and he had him removed from the burning planet and taken to Coruscant, where medical technology and the Force itself were bent toward the work of reconstruction. What emerged from that reconstruction was Darth Vader, the breathing alone like a metronome of darkness, the armor like a second skin that could never be removed, the body rebuilt from the wreckage of Anakin Skywalker into something that had transcended the old limitations of human fragility. And here is the thing I keep thinking about. Mustafar did not create Darth Vader, but Darth Vader would not have been possible without Mustafar, without that specific place, that specific heat, that specific moment of absolute breaking. The planet that kills everything that is not suited to survive became the forge in which a man became something other than human, and Mustafar shifted from being merely a hostile world into being a threshold, a place where transformation happens, where heroes fall and villains rise, and the line between the two becomes so thin that you cannot see it anymore. Padmé was taken from Mustafar to Polis Massa, to a medical facility where she would give birth to twins she would never see grow, and then she would die, as if the planet had reached out and taken her even after she had left it. The child inside her, Anakin's child, would carry forward something of what Mustafar had broken, would carry it across decades, and would eventually stand against the man his father had become. But all of that was still to come. In the immediate aftermath of the duel, with Anakin burning at the lava's edge, and Obi-Wan carrying his lightsaber like a failure he would carry forever, Mustafar became something different from what it had been. It was no longer only a hostile world, a place of mining and exploitation, a laboratory for studying what it meant to survive the unsurvivable. It became mythic. It became the place where the chosen one was unchosen, where the light fell and the darkness rose, where a man became a machine and the galaxy was remade in that image. The lava rivers continued flowing beneath it all, indifferent to the weight of meaning that had been poured into that ground, and Mustafar, the forge of nightmares, became something else entirely. Mustafar, the cradle of legend, the place where everything changed, the threshold between what was and what would be. After the duel, after Anakin's body was remade into something that could survive what would have killed any ordinary man, Mustafar became something new. Not a place the Empire merely controlled, but a place that belonged to Darth Vader, utterly and without question. The transition was quiet at first, in the way institutional power often is. Orders moving through channels, administrative designations shifting on data cards that nobody outside the highest imperial circles would ever see. But within months of Order 66, the pattern became clear. Mustafar was being transformed from a mining colony into a personal stronghold, a threshold between the Empire and something darker. The mining operations that Wat Tambor had built for the Separatists, the Klegger Corp facilities, the collection arms suspended over lava rivers, the pressurized worker habitats. These were not dismantled, but integrated. The Empire had no reason to destroy functional infrastructure, and Vader had no reason to abandon a place that had already proven it could be wrested into serving power. So the miners kept working, and the lava kept flowing, and the rare crystalline minerals kept being extracted from Mustafar's molten heart, now for the Galactic Empire instead of the Separatist cause. What changed was the intent beneath it all. Under Tambor, Mustafar had been a tool for a war effort, brutal, yes, but purposeful in a comprehensible way. Under the Empire, under Vader, it became something else. A personal dominion, a place where one man could pursue projects that no standard Imperial garrison or facility would ever be permitted to house. The first great work was Fortress Vader itself. We know it was constructed atop a Sith nexus, a place where the dark side of the Force ran deep enough that a sensitive being could feel it like a wound in the world. The fortress rose from volcanic rock, designed by an ancient Sith consciousness inhabiting a masked Darth Momin, a sorcerer from an age so distant it barely registered in the historical record, whose obsession with opening gateways between worlds had never truly died. Momin's consciousness guided the design from within his mask, and what emerged was not merely a castle, but something closer to a ritual object built in stone and steel. The fortress's architecture served dual purposes. It could house Vader's operations and personnel, supply depots, communications arrays, the ordinary machinery of command and control. But it was also engineered to amplify the dark side nexus beneath it, to deepen the connection to something that pre-existed the fortress and pre-existed the empire itself. There's a particular kind of attention required to dwell on that fact. This was not the empire as we typically imagine it, organized, rational, governed by bureaucratic logic and strategic resource allocation. This was the empire as it truly was for those at its apex, a vehicle for the expression of will so powerful it seemed to reshape reality around itself. Vader did not merely command the fortress. He inhabited it in a way that suggested symbiosis between man and place. The fortress itself, one might say, demanded the presence of someone like him to complete it, someone who had passed through absolute death and emerged transformed, who had transcended the limits that bound ordinary beings to the laws of the physical world. While the fortress rose, the mining operations continued their terrible rhythm. The Mustafarians themselves, the northern subspecies in particular, with their stocky frames and biology adapted across millennia to survive what no offworlder could, continued to ride their lava fleas through the lava rivers, their labor now directed toward the same crystalline minerals they had always extracted, but now under tighter control, more intensive extraction schedules, greater quotas. The records from this period are sparse, which is itself meaningful. The Empire was not interested in documenting the lives of those it exploited. The data that survives concerns material output, facility efficiency, mineral yields. The workers themselves barely appear in the historical record except as line items, expenditure categories, labor classes, resource allocations. But we can infer from logistics data that the extraction intensified. The mining cycles that had previously rotated workers to allow recovery periods were compressed. The safety margins built into the environmental suits were narrowed as a cost optimization measure. The life expectancy of an off-world miner on Mustafar, already measured in years rather than decades, contracted further. What is striking is how thoroughly normalized this became. Mustafar was hellish, yes, but it was profitable. And under the Empire's logic, which valued the extraction of resources above nearly everything else, profitability was the single metric that mattered. Those who objected were removed. Those who questioned were reassigned. Those who simply endured were given slightly better rations, and the understanding that their sacrifice served the greater good of the Empire. There's something I find myself thinking about often when I consider this period. What it meant that Vader chose to make his seat of power on the very world where he had nearly died, where he had been unmade and rebuilt. The fortress rose on Mustafar not because it was strategically optimal. There were worlds more central, more defensible, more readily supplied. Vader chose Mustafar because the planet itself held meaning for him. The lava rivers that had nearly consumed him, the toxic ash that had nearly poisoned him, the crushing heat that had nearly destroyed him. These were not obstacles to overcome, but elements to integrate, to claim, to remake as instruments of his will. A lesser man might have found the sight of Mustafar unbearable, a constant reminder of defeat and transformation. But Vader was not a lesser man, and Mustafar was not a place of shame for him, but a monument to his own transcendence. He had survived what should have killed him not through any natural gift, but through the power of the dark side itself, through Palpatine's sorcery and the sheer force of will that sustained him through agony. Mustafar, which had unmade Anakin Skywalker on the lava's edge, had been remade in turn as the fortress and dominion of Darth Vader. The planet that had tried to destroy him now served him. And that, I think, is the dark side's most seductive offer, the promise that what wounds you can be seized and transformed, that your suffering can become the foundation of absolute power. Under the Empire, Mustafar entered a long period of intensified exploitation that would persist until the regime's fall decades later. The mines ran continuously, the fortress stood sentinel over the lava rivers, and the world that had once been home to the Mustafarians alone was now claimed utterly by a power from beyond the stars. The Mustafarians themselves endured, adapted, survived, as they always had. But the nature of their survival had shifted, from coexistence with their world to subordination to it, in service to rulers who did not regard them as people, but as resources suited to a particular task. The imperial years on Mustafar were not the bloodiest or most obviously terrible chapter of the world's history. No armies came to conquer it, no great battles were fought within its bounds. But they were perhaps the longest and most grinding extraction of everything the planet had to offer, a systematic transformation of a hellworld into the machinery of empire, sustained by the will of one man who had claimed it as his own. In the years after Order 66, when the Empire's grip on the galaxy had tightened into something absolute, Mustafar's mining operations continued much as they had under the Techno-Union. Only now they answered to Palpatine's central authority and the will of a man who knew the planet's landscape in ways no administrator ever could. Darth Vader had learned Mustafar's lava rivers the hard way, learned them with his body, in the moment before transformation, in the seconds when he believed he was dying there, and Mustafar was the last thing he would ever feel. He survived that encounter not through adaptation, but through technology and the dark side's terrible gift for remaking the broken into something functional. And in surviving it, he had claimed the planet as his own in a way that went deeper than mere administrative control. The Empire's engineers arrived to find an infrastructure already largely in place. Wat Tamba's mining complexes, the collection arms that extended over lava rivers, the cooling systems and pressurized chambers that permitted off-world labor to continue, all of it catalogued and absorbed into Imperial inventory. But Vader's claim transformed what had been merely an industrial operation into something darker, a personal stronghold, a fortress built into volcanic stone above a dark side nexus, designed by an ancient Sith consciousness that had survived in a mask and understood how to amplify the very forces that had nearly unmade him. I think there is something almost terrible in that symmetry. A world that tried to destroy him now serving as the seat of his power, lava that burned him now harnessed into the foundations of his fortress. The mining continued, of course, because Mustafar's minerals remained valuable, rare compounds that could be refined into reactor cores, hull plating, armor alloys, and the Empire's demand was insatiable. But the rhythm of extraction changed under Imperial administration in ways that were, by any measure of human welfare, catastrophic. Safety margins that the Techno-Union had maintained, imperfect as they were systematically narrowed. The cooling suits grew heavier, and their filter systems would deliberately run hotter to extend their operational life. The intervals between maintenance cycles were compressed. A Mustafarian worker's lifespan on the mining lines had always been abbreviated. The records from earlier eras show 2 to 5 years of productivity before cumulative damage forced evacuation or death. But under the Empire, that calculation was reframed. The standard became not how long a worker could survive, but how much could be extracted from them before replacement became necessary. The Mustafarians, with their remarkable physiology, their ability to withstand heat and toxic atmosphere that would liquefy an off-worlder's tissues in minutes, became the preferred labor force precisely because they could sustain longer exposure cycles than any artificial solution the Empire could manufacture. And so they were pressed into increasingly brutal harvesting schedules, riding their lava fleas across rivers that still boiled, operating collection equipment that grew less shielded each year. Their own remarkable adaptation to the planet becoming a justification for exploitation of a kind that would have been impossible with any other species. There is a particular cruelty in that, to be perfectly suited to survive something, and then to have that very suitedness used as a reason to demand it of you, day after day, until even the remarkable breaks. The Techno-Union had used the Mustafarians as a resource, yes, but there had been a kind of economic logic to it. Keep them alive long enough to extract value, because dead workers extract nothing. The Empire's logic was different, colder. It operated from the assumption of infinite replacement, the certainty that Palpatine's administration would endure forever, and therefore it was acceptable to burn through populations the way earlier societies burned through fuel, because there would always be more. The droid armies that had supported the mining operations during the Clone Wars were gradually withdrawn or repurposed, and synthetic labor replaced much of the mechanical component of extraction. Droids, Vader understood, could operate endlessly in Mustafar's inferno without the fragility of organic systems, without the need for rest or psychological stability, or the complicated human question of whether they wanted to be there. Yet even droids required constant maintenance in an environment that corroded circuitry and degraded metallurgy, and so the mining became a strange hybrid. Mustafarian workers in their shielded suits riding lava fleas to mark promising deposits, mechanical harvesters extending collection arms over rivers of molten rock, synthetic laborers carrying extracted ore to processing facilities buried deep in volcanic stone. The processing facilities themselves became grimly sophisticated, temperature-controlled chambers where rare minerals were separated from rock, where the byproducts of extraction were handled by equipment immune to the compounds that would have poisoned organic life. And at the center of it all, accessible by secure transport corridors carved into Mustafar's bedrock, stood Vader's fortress, a structure that served simultaneously as the seat of planetary authority and as a monument to personal transcendence. The fortress itself contained within it a kind of answer to the question that had haunted Mustafar since its first industrial exploitation. How does anyone survive this? The answer, it turned out, was different for different kinds of beings. For the Mustafarians, it meant accepting a shortened lifespan and increased suffering as the price of being supremely adapted to the wrong use. For the Skakon engineers and Imperial administrators who supervised the operations, it meant climate-controlled facilities, Bacta treatments for thermal burns, frequent rotations off-world to recover, and the security of knowing that even if the planet eventually killed them, it would do so slowly enough that they would escape before that moment arrived. For the droids and synthetic laborers, it meant the steady degradation of their systems toward eventual replacement, a different kind of mortality. For Vader, it meant something else entirely. The dark side energy flowing beneath Mustafar's surface, concentrated and amplified by his fortress, was itself a form of sustenance. Not comfort, never that, but a kind of resonance with the forces that had remade him, that could sustain him in ways no Bacta tank alone could replicate. I find myself thinking about the workers a great deal when considering Mustafar under Imperial rule. They knew what they were being asked to endure, and they endured it anyway, either from compulsion or desperation, or the simple fact that refusing was impossible under Vader's administration. The records from those years are sparse. The Empire kept meticulous documentation, but released very little of it. But the fragments that survive paint a picture of extraction at a scale that was impossible under the Techno-Union, achieved through conditions that were worse in almost every measurable way. There is something in that reality that deserves to sit for a moment. The recognition that even technology, even remarkable physiological adaptation, even the will of beings who had learned to survive the unsurvivable, could be systematically ground down by an authority determined to take more than any of them could give. Mustafar, in those imperial years, became a kind of monument to that principle, a place where the planet's lethal nature was no longer an obstacle to be engineered around, but a context to be exploited, a framework within which beings could be pushed harder and asked to give more, because the planet itself would do some of the work of breaking them. The fortress rising above it all served as a constant reminder that some beings had transcended the need for mercy, the need to explain or justify, the need to pretend that any of it served any purpose beyond the acquisition of power. It is, I think, one of the darkest chapters of Mustafar's long and terrible history. And it would persist in various forms for decades. Not because the Empire was particularly fixated on Mustafar, There were other worlds to exploit, but because Vader had claimed it, and Vader's claim extended to everything on it. We have now walked through the physical facts of Mustafar's danger, layer upon layer. The heat that burns, the air that poisons, the pressure that ruptures, the radiation that tears cellular bonds apart. We have traced the history of those who tried to work there, from the early miners, whose employment records span only a handful of years before evacuation, to the techno-union's industrial gamble under Wat Tambor, to the clone soldiers deployed in those final desperate hours of the Clone Wars. And we have seen the extraordinary technology developed to permit survival. The environmental suits with their layered heat-resistant shells, their chemical filtration systems, their pressure regulators, built and maintained and constantly imperfect. There is something I find myself returning to as I sit with all of this, the question of what we mean by survival. Because there is a difference, I think, between surviving and being able to survive indefinitely. The techno-union workers in their suits could last for hours, sometimes days, before seal failures or filter saturation or cumulative radiation damage forced them back to shelter. The Mustafarians, riding their lava fleas across molten seas, moving through the landscape with a grace no off-worlder could match, still faced a grueling limit to their endurance. Accumulated scarring, shortened lifespans, bodies worn down by decades of exposure that even native biology could not fully overcome. Darth Vader, remade in armor and machinery, claimed Mustafar as his own fortress, a place that nearly destroyed him remade into his seat of power. Yet even he required constant, active intervention, the fortress maintaining him as much as he maintained his dominion. The scientific consensus, examined across all eras of Mustafar's industrial history, is remarkably clear. There is no threshold at which a human body, even aided by the finest environmental technology, can simply exist on Mustafar and expect to endure indefinitely. Everything requires active maintenance, constant repair, continuous intervention. The suits fail. The respirators clog. The cooling systems degrade. The seals that separate life from incineration are not passive. They demand attention, expertise, the presence of someone understanding and monitoring the systems from moment to moment. I think about the engineers who designed the techno-union suits, understanding intimately the calculus of pressure and heat and toxicity they were trying to hold at bay. They would have known, in a way perhaps not explicitly stated but certainly understood, that they were building a temporary boundary, not a permanent solution. The suits were not a triumph over Mustafar's hostility. They were a negotiation with it, a tense arrangement where the environment agreed to kill you a little more slowly if you wore the right armor and kept the systems fed. Look at the historical record across the mining operations. Workers rotated off Mustafar not because shifts ended, but because their suit's effectiveness had degraded to a point where remaining posed unacceptable risk. There was no graduation from exposure, no threshold at which your body adapted enough that you could set the armor aside. The native Mustafarians come closest to representing a genuine alternative, and yet even their biological adaptation did not grant them true freedom from Mustafar's demands. They could ride where off-worlders would burn, breathe where off-worlders would suffocate, but they still aged faster than their kin on other worlds, still bore the scars of their environment, still faced a life shortened by the cumulative toll of existing on a planet that is, at its core, organized to destroy. Here is what the science reveals when you set aside hope and mythology. Mustafar does not permit survival, it negotiates temporary endurance. You do not survive Mustafar by overcoming it or mastering it or adapting to it. You survive Mustafar by being continuously remade by technology or biology, or, if we are speaking of Vader, by something darker and more terrible than either. A transformation so absolute that you are no longer the thing that can be killed by heat and poison and pressure, but also no longer the thing that can be alive in any ordinary sense. This is the point of no return that the science establishes. The acknowledgement that there is no permanent solution, no final armor, no stage at which you can relax your vigilance and trust in your own survival. The miners understood this when they boarded the shuttles to return to shelter. Wat Tambor understood this, driving his operation harder despite knowing the cost in lives and efficiency and the slow degradation of the machinery itself. Anakin Skywalker understood this in a different way. In the moment of nearly being unmade entirely, when Obi-Wan's cut left him burning at the edge of a lava river, his body ceasing to be something that could exist in the normal way. And Palpatine understood this when he chose to rebuild him not as something that could adapt to Mustafar, but as something that would rule it through transcendence and force, a being so transformed that the planet's hostility became almost irrelevant, because he was no longer human enough to be killed by it in the old way. What strikes me most forcefully, contemplating this layer of the analysis, is not the danger itself. We have spent considerable time with the danger, and it is real and utterly unforgiving. Rather, it is the honesty embedded in the scientific record of those who tried, and those who built the tools for trying. There is no delusion in the historical record, no moment where the engineers or administrators or workers claimed they had finally solved Mustafar. They knew better. They knew that every suit was a temporary shelter, every facility a brief hold against a surrounding that wanted them gone. They accepted this and worked anyway, because the minerals were valuable and the work had to be done, and because that is what humans do. We build fragile things and tend them carefully and understand that we are negotiating with forces much larger than ourselves, not defeating them. And so when someone asks you, as many people eventually do, whether you could survive a day on Mustafar with the right equipment, the scientific answer is more nuanced than a simple no, yet more complicated than a simple yes. You could survive for hours, with the right suit, with constant maintenance, with the expertise to keep your systems functioning and the awareness to monitor your conditions every moment. You could survive a day, perhaps, if everything held and nothing failed, and you were careful and fortunate. But you would not be free on Mustafar, even armored. You would be in a state of continuous, moment-to-moment negotiation, with a place that is fundamentally and absolutely hostile to your existence. There is no graduation from that. There is only the suit, and the suit only lasts as long as its weakest seal. Let that settle for a moment. The point of no return, in scientific terms, is the acknowledgement that Mustafar is not a place to be overcome or conquered or finally adapted to. It is a place to be survived provisionally, temporarily, always on borrowed time. And perhaps that is what makes it more dangerous than any other description could. Not that it will kill you quickly, but that it permits you to live just long enough to understand what you are losing in the continuing effort to do so. There is a question that runs underneath everything we have been building toward across these hours, and I have been holding it back until now because it deserves to arrive at the right moment, and that moment is here. If Mustafar is as fundamentally lethal as we have established, if the temperature alone would kill, if the atmosphere alone would kill, if the pressure alone would kill, then how is it that the Mustafarians have lived there, thrived there, built mining operations and herds of lava fleas and entire civilizations in the spaces between one extinction event and the next? The answer, I think, lies in something we have not yet seriously examined. The sheer strangeness of Mustafarian biology, a body plan so far removed from baseline humanoid form that it seems almost to mock the idea of survival as we understand it. The Mustafarians are not human, and this is not an incidental detail. They are insectoid beings. Their skin is not skin as you might picture it, but something closer to an exoskeleton, a heat-resistant carapace that seems almost to be made of the planet itself, hardened and reinforced and fundamentally indifferent to temperatures that would cook a human being from the outside in. To look at a Mustafarian is to see a being whose entire biological architecture has been rewritten by generations of living in an environment that rewrites or kills everything that does not adapt. There are two distinct populations on Mustafar, and they are so different that early off-world observers sometimes mistook them for separate species entirely, which speaks to how thoroughly the planet has divided its inhabitants along environmental lines. The northern Mustafarians are tall and lanky, their frames elongated and thin, built for movement across narrow volcanic outcroppings and the treacherous terrain of the northern lava fields, where the ground is less stable and agility matters more than mass. The southern Mustafarians are shorter and broader, their bodies compressed and powerful, built for endurance in the deeper heat of the southern mining regions, where the pressure climbs toward lethal, and the temperatures never truly cool, even by Mustafar's standards, where a creature needs weight and strength to keep itself anchored against forces that would tear a slighter being apart. Both populations share the insectoid exoskeleton, the heat-resistant skin, the capacity to survive conditions that would liquefy a human being, but they have been shaped by their specific territories into two answers to the same question. What does a thinking being look like when it has survived here for 10,000 years or more? I find myself thinking about what that means, not just the biological adaptation, but the civilizational weight of it. The fact that the Mustafarians did not arrive on their planet from somewhere else and have to learn survival, the way the Techno-Union workers did, the way soldiers did, the way even Anakin Skywalker eventually had to learn it through darkness and machinery. The Mustafarians were born into Mustafar as Mustafar, and the planet is not something external that they must negotiate with, but something that is written into the deepest architecture of what they are. And yet, even with such an adaptation, even with bodies seemingly engineered by millennia of selection for survival in the Inferno, the Mustafarians are not invulnerable. The historical record is sparse. The Mustafarians do not appear extensively in early Republic documentation because the Republic, for the most part, did not care about them until the Separatists and the Techno-Union arrived and transformed Mustafar from a remote world into a strategic resource. But what we know suggests that even native populations face diminished lifespans in the deepest lava regions, accumulated trauma, and the slow wearing down that comes from living perpetually at the edge of biological tolerance. The mining operations that the Mustafarians themselves conducted before off-world intervention were nothing like the industrial scale of the Techno-Union's later facilities, but they were still extraction, still labor, still a constant negotiation with a planet that gives nothing freely. The miners rode lava fleas, remarkable creatures in their own right, arachnid-like beings with the capacity to cling to stone and move across surfaces that would melt ordinary flesh. Their hides tough enough to serve as clothing and shelter. Their biology another answer to the question of what adaptation looks like here. The Mustafarians had learned not just to survive Mustafar, but to use it, to harvest the minerals that lay in the lava and the volcanic rock, to build a civilization that took from the planet without being entirely consumed by it, which is a far more remarkable achievement than it might seem from the comfortable distance of worlds that do not actively try to murder their inhabitants. But here is the crucial thing. Even the Mustafarians, even a species evolved over countless generations to thrive in this hellscape, even creatures whose very biology is a victory of adaptation, even they did not conquer Mustafar. They endured it. They negotiated with it. They built lives in the spaces it permitted them to build in. And when the Techno-Union arrived, when the Empire later intensified the mining operations, when Darth Vader claimed the planet as his own personal stronghold, the Mustafarians were forced to endure more, to work harder, to spend more of their shortened lifespans in the deepest and most brutal sectors of the mining operations, precisely because their remarkable physiology allowed them to survive what would kill anyone else. Which is another way of saying that their adaptation became their prison. There is something almost tragic in this, and I have been thinking about it across the whole of this documentary. The universe is full of adaptive wonders, beings shaped by their worlds into forms that seem impossible until you understand the slow logic of survival driving each adaptation. And yet the very capacity to survive a hostile environment is so often read by those seeking profit and power as permission to exploit it completely. The Techno-Union saw Mustafarian physiology and did not think, remarkable, there is a species that has solved an impossible problem. They thought useful, and later the Empire thought it as well. When Darth Vader built his fortress above the dark side nexus, this we touched on in an earlier chapter, the ancient Sith power beneath Mustafar's surface, the confluence of physical and spiritual hostility that made the planet so significant. He was not bringing something new to Mustafar's history of exploitation, but he was intensifying it beyond measure, consolidating it into the service of a single dark side will. And the Mustafarians continued to labor, their adaptation to the planet's heat serving not their own survival anymore, but the desires of beings who had mastered the art of making other beings' strengths serve their own ends. By the present day, by the time we circle back to the question we began with, would you survive a day on Mustafar? The Mustafarians remain on their world, their remarkable biology still intact, still making survival possible in conditions that remain fundamentally lethal to everyone else. But their civilization has been reshaped entirely by centuries of outside exploitation, their population diminished, their role in the larger galactic order reduced to that of a managed resource. And yet they persist, which is itself a kind of answer. Not to the question of whether an unprotected human could survive Mustafar. That answer has not changed, and it is still no. But to a deeper question about what it means to be native to a world that is trying to kill you and to keep living anyway. What it means to have evolved for exactly this purpose, to have survived for thousands of years, and then to have those strengths used against you by outsiders who never had to evolve for anything. There is something in that. The Mustafarians have not conquered Mustafar, and they never will, because you cannot conquer a world that is part of yourself. But they have done something that may be rarer. They have lived there, truly lived, for an immeasurable stretch of time. And in doing so, they have proven that survival in the Hellfire is possible, even if the price of survival is everything else. It is a victory, I think, even in its tragedy. In the time I have spent walking through Mustafar's dangers, the heat, the poisoned air, the crushing pressure, the invisible radiation that scars the cellular world, I have been circling around something that finally needs to be said plainly. None of these horrors, terrible as they are, kills you alone. The temperature alone would do it, eventually, if you had an atmosphere clean enough to breathe and a suit that held its pressure. But it would take longer than you might expect, because the human body is remarkably stubborn in the face of heat. The toxic atmosphere, if somehow the temperature were survivable and the suit held, would damage you relentlessly, your lungs filling with fluid, your blood chemistry unraveling. But there is a sequence to that unraveling, time measured in hours rather than minutes. The pressure, those crushing weights in the southern mining regions, where the air pressed down at nearly 2.5 times what your body evolved to bear, would rupture you from within, but not instantaneously. The damage would accumulate, your tissues would fail in a cascading pattern, and you would have a window, brief but real, before the end came. Even the radiation, that silent bombardment from the volcanic emissions and the unstable isotopes in Mustafar's crust, works slowly, cellular damage accruing across minutes and hours, building toward eventual catastrophe, but not instant death. The equation, though, is where it becomes truly lethal. You do not face temperature in isolation, or atmosphere alone, or pressure by itself. You face all of them at once, and they do not add together like numbers on a ledger. They multiply, each one accelerating the others, each one making the body's defenses less capable of responding to the next threat. This is the insight that emerges when you sit with the data from the mining records, from the suit's telemetry, from the few accounts we have of what happened to workers when their life support systems began to fail. The heat triggers rapid, uncontrolled sweating, your body's primary cooling mechanism. The sweat pours out and evaporates almost instantly in the superheated air. But in doing so, it carries away vast quantities of water and electrolytes, dehydrating you with terrifying speed. Dehydration thickens your blood, stressing your cardiovascular system. A stressed cardiovascular system cannot circulate blood as efficiently to your extremities, which means the heat damage accelerates, which triggers more desperate sweating, which dehydrates you further, and the cycle locks into place. Meanwhile, the toxic atmosphere is attacking your respiratory system. Sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide burning your mucous membranes, ash clogging your airways, carbon monoxide binding to your hemoglobin and suffocating your cells at a chemical level. Your lungs, desperately trying to bring in oxygen, pull harder and deeper, which means you breathe in more of the poison, which means your body tries harder still, which means the damage cascades. The pressure, if you are in the southern regions where the mining facilities ran deepest, is crushing your tissues all the while, your sinuses rupturing as the pressure differential tears the delicate spaces in your face and skull. Your cardiovascular system, already stressed by dehydration and chemical asphyxia, now has to work against pressure that is trying to rupture blood vessels from the inside. At some point, and I want to be precise about this, because precision matters when we are discussing how human beings actually fail, the systems simply cannot compensate for each other anymore. You are losing water faster than any biological tolerance. Your blood is becoming toxic to your own cells. Your lungs are drowning in their own fluid. Your sinuses are weeping blood. And your heart is trying to push poisoned, thickened blood through a body being crushed by air pressure and roasted by radiant heat. The timeline I sketched in an earlier chapter, the one where an unprotected human lasts perhaps an hour on Mustafar's surface before the irreversible cascade reaches a breaking point, assumes all of these factors working in concert. That hour is not a comfortable hour. It is not even a survivable hour in any meaningful sense. You are dying from the moment your skin is exposed to the thermal radiation. But it is a window during which the human body, stubborn and complex, and built with redundancies that reach back through millennia of evolution, attempts to survive despite the impossible. What the miners understood, what Tamba's engineers understood when they designed the suits, what the Mustafarians have always known in their bodies, is that there is no separating these factors. You cannot design a suit that protects you from temperature alone, because the moment you protect from the heat, you have created an insulated chamber, and the pressure becomes more lethal, not less. You cannot filter the atmosphere without simultaneously creating pressure differential problems, because the filters that remove sulfur compounds and ash are heavy and restrictive, and they make your suit more rigid, more prone to seal failure under pressure stress. You cannot account for radiation with armor, because the materials that block certain radiation are themselves heat conductors, or pressure sensitive, or toxic when they outgas under thermal stress. Every solution introduces new problems. The Techno Union knew this. Their suit designs represent the absolute pinnacle of what engineering can achieve when you have unlimited resources and unlimited willingness to burn through workers. Even those suits failed regularly. Even those suits killed people, despite everything they attempted. And the Mustafarians, whose biology represents millions of years of adaptation to this specific set of conditions, even they do not truly conquer Mustafar. They negotiate with it. They survive on its terms. They accept shortened lives and accumulated damage as the price of simply existing on a world that is fundamentally, relentlessly, systematically hostile to carbon-based life as we understand it. There is a final truth embedded in this equation, though one that I have been approaching throughout these chapters and that now asks to be stated. Mustafar is not merely a set of environmental hazards that happen to be present together. It is not a collection of random, unfortunate atmospheric and geological circumstances that created a hostile world. The scientific data supports this. Yes, the volcanic geology, the heat, the toxic emissions, the pressure anomalies, all of it flows from demonstrable physical processes. But there is something else beneath it, something that appears in every historical account of workers on Mustafar, in the way the Mustafarians describe their relationship with the planet, in the choice that Darth Vader made to claim this world as his fortress and not any other. Mustafar seems to resist those who would survive it. Not randomly, not incidentally, but with a kind of purpose that makes no scientific sense and yet appears consistent across centuries of observation. This is not something I can quantify, but it is something worth noting as we approach the final answer. The equation that kills you on Mustafar is not merely mathematical. It is not only the sum of temperature and toxins and pressure and radiation. Those are real, and they are lethal, and they are enough on their own. But the planet seems to possess something additional, a weight, a hunger, a fundamental rejection of those who do not belong to it. For now, settle with this. The layers of danger are many. They interact in ways that make each one worse, and together they create a hostile environment that no unprotected human has ever survived, and none ever will. Everything that follows, the rare exceptions, the near miraculous adaptations, the answer itself, rests on this understanding that Mustafar is not simply deadly, but comprehensively, systematically, and perhaps even deliberately so. So we arrive, at last, at the answer itself, and I find I need to sit with it quietly for a moment before saying it aloud. You would not survive a day on Mustafar. Not unprotected, not unprepared, not with the ordinary human body you were born with, the skin and lungs and cardiovascular system that evolved over millennia in the gentler corners of the galaxy. The answer is simple, but it arrives after we've walked through layers, temperature exceeding 1300 degrees, atmospheric poison that burns from the inside, pressure that ruptures what holds you together, radiation that damages the cells you need to think and move and survive. None of these alone might be the final blow. But they do not arrive alone. They arrive together, each one amplifying the others in a cascade that the best environmental suits ever engineered could only delay, not prevent. Even Wat Tamba's techno-union technology, designed by brilliant minds, reinforced by necessity, refined across years of lethal trial, could only purchase time. Hours instead of minutes, days instead of hours, a negotiation with forces that fundamentally did not want you there. The miners knew this. The clone soldiers who fought on Mustafar knew this. The native Mustafarians, whose biology permits them what no off-worlder could achieve, still knew it, because their remarkable adaptation did not grant them mastery. Only a longer conversation with a world that remains, even to them, inhospitable and demanding and ultimately costly. Even now, in the Imperial era, with Vader's fortress standing above the dark side nexus, with droid harvesters and synthetic laborers, and the full machinery of the Empire committed to extraction, the planet exacts its price. Lifespan, health, the slow accumulation of exposure until bodies give way. You would not survive a day. But here is the thing I find myself returning to, the thought that lingers after all the numbers and the physiology and the historical accounts have settled. The simple fact of Mustafar's refusal to accommodate human life is precisely what made it legendary. Think of how many worlds exist in the galaxy, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, each with its own history, its own resources, its own significance in the larger story of civilizations rising and falling. Most of them are forgotten, not because they lack beauty or importance, but because they are survivable, because someone can walk there without specialized armor and live to tell the tale, because they do not demand everything from those who dare to inhabit them. Mustafar demands everything, and because it demands everything, it transforms those it touches. The early miners came seeking wealth and found instead a crucible that shortened their lives and tested their will in ways the safer worlds never could. Wat Tamba came seeking control and found instead a planet that would slip from his grasp the moment the clone wars ended that would never truly belong to anyone who was not willing to remake themselves entirely. The Separatist Council came seeking refuge and found instead a world that cared nothing for politics or power structures or the grand designs of beings who thought themselves larger than mountains of stone and rivers of fire. And Anakin Skywalker came, whether arriving at the moment of his own volition or drawn by forces beyond his control. And on Mustafar, the chosen one was unmade. A man walked into that mining facility believing he could transcend the limitations that bound others, believing that love and power and the Force itself would let him rise above the ordinary rules of mortality and consequence. Mustafar answered him with heat and poison, and the simple truth that even someone gifted beyond measure could be broken by forces more fundamental than will or destiny. When Obi-Wan severed his limbs and left him burning at the lava's edge, Mustafar was not being cruel, it was being itself. It is the planet's indifference, I think, that makes the duel legendary rather than simply tragic. Mustafar did not care that a chosen one lay dying on its surface. It would have killed any of us with equal dispassion. And then Palpatine arrived, and Mustafar transformed Anakin once more, not into a human, not into anything that truly lived, but into something remade entirely, something that had surrendered every ordinary claim to survival and become instead an instrument of will that could not be unmade by the very forces that had nearly destroyed him. Darth Vader walks on Mustafar without suit or helmet, and the world's lethal conditions no longer touch him because he is no longer substantially there to be touched. He has become armor, machinery, the dark side given physical form. And in that transformation lies a kind of answer to our original question, not an answer that offers hope, but an answer nonetheless. If you wanted to survive a day on Mustafar, if you wanted to walk its surface and breathe its air and endure its heat without technological intervention, you would have to stop being human. You would have to undergo a transformation so complete that survival on Mustafar would become irrelevant because the person surviving would be unrecognizable. The Mustafarians came closest. Evolution shaped them across millennia to thrive in conditions that kill others, to ride lava creatures and mine molten rock, and build lives in a place that most beings would cross the galaxy to avoid. But even they do not truly survive Mustafar. They negotiate with it day after day, year after year, their bodies adapted but never comfortable, their lifespans shortened by the effort, their communities defined by a kind of ongoing agreement with a world that could dissolve them at any moment. There is something profound in that. There is something true about a world that does not let you win, that does not permit the easy confidence of someone standing on a survivable planet and looking around at the wide sky. On Mustafar, you are always aware that the ground beneath your feet could open, that the air you are breathing burns, that the very heat pressing against your suit or your skin or your armor is trying to unmake you with patient, systematic force. You would not survive a day on Mustafar. And that is not a failure of your body, or your will, or your courage. It is simply the nature of what Mustafar is. It is a world that refused adaptation, that remained fundamentally hostile even to those who were born there, that claimed and reshaped and occasionally destroyed the beings who came seeking to master it. It is a world that did not become legendary because it was hospitable or noble or easy. It became legendary because it was unforgiving. Because even Anakin Skywalker, with all his gifts and all his power, could not survive what Mustafar offered him without ceasing to be himself. Because Darth Vader, who commands fleets and bends the Force to his will and rules the darkness itself, still stands above a dark side nexus on Mustafar, drawing power from the planet as though the planet itself were a kind of teacher, showing him again and again what it means to transcend the ordinary. Mustafar is legendary not in spite of being lethal, but because of it. That is the answer. And as that answer settles in, I find myself grateful for a world that does not pretend to welcome us, that does not soften its hostility for the sake of comfort, that remains honestly, fundamentally itself. A crucible, a threshold, a place where the ordinary ends and only transformation permits continuation. And perhaps that is enough to know.